Soon, cops will raid Edward Gein's house, and what they'll find there won't just disturb them, it'll break them. Many will never be the same after that. But today, Edward scoops one last spoonful of soup from the bowl he's fashioned from a human skull. He then empties the remnants of the soup into a wastebasket made from skin. Today's a big day for Ed. He's finally finished stitching together a very special suit he's made. Illuminated by the light of a lamp that's covered with what looks like faces, Ed first slips on a pair of leggings that look like legs, and next he slips onto his corset, a garment that once served as part of the torso of a woman. He pulls everything tight with a belt decorated with, you guessed it, bits of what used to be a person. He's almost ready now. There's just one last piece of his new outfit to put on, a human face mask. He looks in the mirror and thinks, perfect. He's finally become his mother. His masterpiece is complete. Reeling with joy, he runs into the garden and dances under a full moon. We're talking now about possibly the strangest serial killer to have ever walked the planet. His story is like no other. Ed was truly unique in his depravity, and that's why he inspired movies such as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Silence of the Lambs. But if there's one movie that fits Ed's life like a glove, it's Psycho. We're sure you'll agree with us after you've watched the story that Mr. Edward Gein was a true American psycho. The question is, how did he get away with his crimes for so long? Did no one in that small town of his not wonder if there was anything a little bit strange about the man? His entire house was full of things made from human body parts. To do that, he needed quite the stock of bodies. How did he get them? How did he manage to do it without the local cops noticing? But first, let's go back in time and talk about the young Ed Gein. How did a young man become such a monster? A guy that would become known as the Butcher of Plainfield. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906 in a place called La Crosse County in the state of Wisconsin. His parents, George and Augusta, had one other son named Henry. Life wasn't easy for the family. George couldn't hold down a job for long and support his wife and sons for the simple fact that he devoted much of his time to something other than family. That thing was whiskey. Augusta, someone who you might call a controlling matriarch, wasn't happy with the life she had. To try and improve matters, she made the decision to move the family across counties to the small rural village of Plainfield. There, they would work on an isolated farm, barely ever seeing the 700 or so other residents of the village. The two boys went to the local school, but it seemed to the teachers that there was something wrong with the boys. Ed had this habit of just laughing out loud for no good reason. He didn't have many friends, and even if he did make friends, his mother would soon put a stop to the relationship. You see, to understand Ed's later behavior, you really need to know a thing or two about his mother. She might have had an alcoholic husband who often returned home stinking of demon liquor, a man who could barely put food on the table. But she was no angel herself. She not only despised her own husband, but she despised everyone besides her kids. The only reason she didn't ask for a divorce was that it was against her religious beliefs. When not in school, both Ed and Henry weren't allowed off the farm. Augusta's reasoning was that most people were evil. She preached to the boys daily about the depravity of mankind, reading chapters from the Bible about the fires of hell awaiting most folks. She told her kids that those who take to the bottle will meet with eternal damnation. She told them that women were loose, that they couldn't be trusted, and that they too would one day have a date with the devil. Of course, Augusta said she was not one of those women. She was moral. She had committed herself to God. Her Bible was her blueprint for life. We don't need to tell you that this kind of overbearing mothering isn't great for kids, especially when you throw demons and hellfire into the mix. We'll get to the crime soon, but you need to know a little bit more about Ed's pre-skin suit life. The whiskey eventually killed George when Ed and Henry were in their 30s. After that, both men worked on the farm and did odd jobs around the village to make ends meet. They did handiwork for locals, but something Ed really enjoyed doing was babysitting. Yep, the Butcher of Plainfield was great with kids, likely because his own development had been arrested due to his mother's strictness. This is what one of the townsfolk actually said about Ed's way with the kids. Good old Ed, kind of a loner and maybe a bit odd with that sense of humor of his, but just the guy to call to sit in with the kiddies. And get this, people still sent their kids to stay with Ed long after his mother died. Some of those kids told their parents that they'd seen shrunken heads and strange masks around his house, but the parents dismissed this as the kids being over-imaginative. So Augusta still had a firm grip on Ed's mind even though the child had grown into a man. Henry had at least managed to get into a relationship with a local woman, but Ed was still too attached to his mom to think about other women. Henry would actually talk to others about how Ed was way too obsessed with their religious zealot of a mom. And when Ed heard this, he wasn't happy. He didn't want to hear anyone talking badly about Augusta. With that in mind, what happened when Ed was 38 years old might not surprise you. There was a huge fire at the farm. Firefighters were called and managed to quell the flames, and then they left. Ed later called the police department and told the cops he couldn't find his brother. A search party went out at night with their lanterns glowing all over the farm, and they eventually found Henry. He was dead. He wasn't burned at all. He was just lying on the ground with his face in the mud. Surprisingly, the cops said no foul play. The coroner said Henry had died of asphyxiation. He said that, even though it appeared that Henry had been hit over the head with something. Was it Ed who killed Henry? Did Ed want to be the sole benefactor of his mother's adoration? Most people think yes. Had the cops worked a bit harder, they likely would have prevented the rise of the monster. Not long after Henry's downfall, Augusta suffered a terrible stroke that left her paralyzed. Now Ed had to play nurse for his mother, with her shouting orders as her devoted son ran around doing all the jobs in the house. Nothing Ed could do could save her. She had another stroke soon after and died. To say the least, the adoring son of that Bible-waving beast was devastated. The house just got messier and messier, but not in one room. Ed kept his mother's room as clean as possible, making it a shrine to her. He also boarded up many of the other rooms in the house, with his main room being the kitchen. He still babysat from time to time, but his biggest joy was reading books about Japanese and German atrocities during the Second World War. He also had a thing for detective pulp fiction. Books back then often included gory stories of cannibalism in the Pacific. Ed managed to get by doing odd jobs, and he also enjoyed a windfall from some land he sold that had once been his brother's. What the locals in the village didn't know at this time was that Ed had lost his head. The death of his mother had traumatized him to the extent he was dangerously psychotic. He had become deranged, and there was no going back. We don't know the exact time when Ed started playing around with corpses, but it's thought that during the late 40s and early 50s he was grave digging and killing. He'd sometimes wait until someone had been buried, and then he'd sneak off to the graveyard in the middle of the night and exhume the corpse. He's now called a necrophiliac serial killer, which means he gratified himself sexually with the bodies before he got to work on making things from them. Let's now fast forward in time and tell you about what the cops saw when they entered the property and had the shock of their lives. A shock some people say killed the local sheriff. What he saw that day was so terrible, so unthinkable, he was overwhelmed with feelings of disgust, horror, and sadness. He died soon after from heart failure. It was the deputy sheriff that first arrived on the property. He opened a barn door, and before his eyes he saw a dead woman hanging upside down from a beam. To him, she looked like an animal that had been killed and was in the process of being butchered. She had already been split down the middle, and her internal organs had been removed. It was enough to make the cop vomit on the spot. Her head had been removed, and the tendons in her ankles had been cut and a rod thread through them. It sure was a sight to behold. Worse still, the police found her head in a burlap bag. Ed had driven a nail in each of her ears and fastened a string to them as if to make a kind of hanging trophy. There was much worse to come. The rest of the police department arrived on the scene. Now it was time to check the rooms of the main house. In the kitchen, they discovered Ed had likely been thinking about doing some cooking. On the stove was the heart of a woman, kept next to a bunch of cooking pots. Cops would later say Ed was no doubt a cannibal as well as a necrophile, and what really turned the stomachs of the town folks was that they'd often eaten packages of meat Ed had given to them. Did that make them cannibals too? Inside the houses, they found stacks of human bones. They found at least 10 severed heads. Some of those heads had the faces peeled off of them. They ended up becoming Ed's face mask collection. To make them more realistic, he'd adorned some of their lips with lipstick. One of the cops who saw those masks remarked that the people were very recognizable. One of the faces of a recent victim had only just been removed, and Ed had placed that one in a paper bag. The cops weren't anywhere near finished with their search. They found the skin wastebasket we told you about. They found chairs with human skin coverings. There were skulls with the tops sawn off, female genitals stored in a shoebox. They found noses, lips attached to a drawstring, female fingernails, a human skin lampshade, skulls on bedposts, and of course, Ed's pièce de résistance, his human bodysuit replete with the breasts of a woman. So after his arrest, how did Ed explain himself? He admitted that he robbed the graves of women, He wanted his mother back, and making things from the body parts of women was kind of like having his mother around all the time. By making a woman suit, he could actually become his mother. It turned out that those kids had been right, and indeed Ed had kept shrunken heads in his house. One kid, a 16-year-old who sometimes went to see ball games with Ed, said Ed always had told him the heads and faces were all stuff he'd collected that had come from the Philippines. That wasn't true. They were all local women. Cops did wonder how a man could dig up a grave all by himself in just one night, but when they went to the graves of the victims, sure enough, the women or most of the women were missing from their coffins. Occasionally, Ed would take what he needed from the body and later return the body parts he wasn't interested in. So, what led the police to Ed's house in the first place? That was because the police went to a local store and found a trail of blood. The blood of a woman named Bernice Warden. Ed had shot her and slit her throat, and then he proceeded to drag her body out of the store and take it to his house. Hers was the body hanging from that beam, and Ed had literally left a trail of blood for police to follow. The cops also found out from Bernice's son that Ed had been in the store the day before and said he'd come back in a day or two to buy a gallon of antifreeze. On the floor of the store, the cops found a bloodied receipt for a gallon of antifreeze. Ed didn't immediately admit to his crime, but the cops used a tried and tested technique to get him to confess. It was simple enough. They just made him look at the corpse of the woman he killed and mutilated, and in the end, he cracked. He also admitted to killing a tavern keeper he knew well, a woman named Mary Hogan. A mask made from her face was found in his house. At first, the cops didn't believe that all those body parts in Ed's house had been robbed from graves. What they thought they had on their hands was one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. But as we said, Ed told them about the graves he'd robbed, and he wasn't lying. He also said he only killed people when the ground was so hard from the cold it made exhuming bodies impossible. He guessed his grave robbing lasted from 1947 to 1952, and he added that at times he'd been helped by a man named Gus, who stopped helping Ed when he was forced to live in a home for the elderly. We probably don't need to tell you that the Wisconsin State Crime Lab had never heard a story like this before. At first, Ed was reluctant to open up to investigators, but the longer he was with them, the more he talked. They listened as he explained the thing he liked to do the most was put on his tan skin suit, don one of his face masks, put female sex organs over his male sex organs, and then run around in the garden, especially when it was a full moon. That may sound about as crazy can get, but with only 2 murders under his belt, how come Ed Gein is called a serial killer? Isn't it 3 or more kills that gets a person into the serial killer hall of infamy? Well, it's generally thought Ed killed quite a few more people. Remember, he lived in a pretty remote area, and so we can tell you that other people went missing around the places where Ed frequented, and well, the cops thought he likely was behind those disappearances. Police found the genitals of girls in Ed's house, and it's now believed that they belonged to some missing local girls. It's also believed that Ed was behind the disappearances of 2 deer hunters who left the Plainfield Tavern one night and were never seen again. One of the missing men's jacket and his dead dog were found on the Gein farm. The judge who presided over Ed's trial later wrote that there was little doubt Ed had killed more than 2 people. That judge found Ed not guilty by reason of insanity and sent him to serve out his sentence at Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. It's actually quite unusual for serial killers to receive this verdict, but we don't think many people would disagree with the judge in this case. Ed Gein almost certainly had a case of what's called the Oedipal complex, a psychosexual condition in which a child desires his parent of the opposite sex. Ed's mother's fanatic talk of God and the devil and telling her sons that all women were bad except for her no doubt was the foundation of Ed's obsession with her and his exclusion from other women. He actually told the police in what they said was a chatty way that he was also obsessed with the power of women, but unable to actually be close to a living woman. He decided he'd surround himself with dead ones. He told police his victims were usually quite plump, just like his beloved mom. He always denied he had intercourse with the bodies, saying they smelled too bad. The cops didn't believe him, but were taken aback when Ed told them he took great pleasure in skinning women. The police said what was surprising was the cheerful, matter-of-fact way he spoke. It seemed to them as if Ed felt he hadn't really done anything wrong. Ed Gein died from lung cancer and respiratory illness in 1984 at the age of 77. If there is such a thing as an afterlife, he's probably quite made up since he's buried with his mother. There's just one problem though. Henry also takes up space in that plot. As for that old farmhouse, the building that was the inspiration for the house in the movie Psycho, it was burned down in 1958 while Ed was serving time. It was no accident, of course, but no one was ever arrested. When Ed was told his dear mother's house was gone, that his childhood home had been destroyed, he replied, "Just as well." Believe it or not, the nurses who were charged with taking care of Ed said he was a lovely man, although some of them said he liked to stare a lot. He was docile most of the time and proved to be quite excellent at sewing and other handicrafts. A young woman walks down an alleyway on her way home from college, illuminated only in small puddles of light by the lamps above her. Little does she know that a man will be waiting for her as she emerges into the car park. Poor soul, she thinks after seeing that well-dressed man is struggling to carry books to his Volkswagen Beetle, especially as one of his arms is in a sling. She walks over to him and offers assistance, to which the polite and softly spoken man gives her his utmost thanks. As she takes some of the books and leans down to place them in the passenger seat, he hits her over the head with a tire iron. He gets into the driver's seat and leaves the scene. He'll strangle her like he did many others. He'll do unspeakable things to her. He is the quintessential maniac. His name is Ted Bundy. The scene we've just described to you was the modus operandi of this particular serial killer. Well, when he had planned his murders. Bundy's thing was to use his good looks, his speaking skills, and his educated demeanor to lure people into his trap. At times, he'd put his arm in a sling or even walk on crutches to give his victims a false sense of security. How harmful could a man be on crutches, one dressed in a suit, driving a cute car? This is why he was so hard to catch. He just didn't fit the profile of a serial killer, one who did absolutely disgusting things to people at the moment they died and after they died. He probably should have been caught much earlier than he was. After all, when young women went out and never came back, on a few occasions witnesses came forward and said they had seen a man lurking around, a man with one arm in a sling, a man that drove a VW Bug. 22-year-old Brenda Carol Ball was last seen talking to a guy in a car park who had brown hair and an arm in a sling. Soon after, Susan Elaine Rancourt went missing, never to return. 2 people came forward after that and said they'd been approached by a man who wore a sling. He'd asked them for help putting some books into his car, a VW Beetle. Then, on June 11, 1974, University of Washington student Georgianne Hawkins went missing. Her body would never be found. We know that she'd been with her boyfriend and she left him after midnight. On her walk home to her sorority house, she was spotted by a male friend who was driving a car. He shouted out of the window, "Hey George, what's happening?" She chatted with him for a minute or two and expressed that she was a bit nervous about her upcoming Spanish exam. Later, witnesses told the cops that they'd seen some guy skulking around in an alleyway close to Hawkins's, a guy whose arm was in a sling. One woman said he'd asked her to help him load a briefcase into a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. Little did she know at the time how close she was to being murdered. Hawkins wasn't so lucky. She fell for the trick, as any helpful person might. We know what happened to her because Bundy later talked about it. When she was close enough to his car, he hit her over the head with a crowbar, which knocked her clean out. When she came around, she was obviously confused, although to Bundy's surprise, she seemed to think that he'd turned up to help her with Spanish. She was evidently in shock. This is what Bundy said about that. It's odd the kinds of things people will say under those circumstances. He strangled her and dumped her body, a body he would return to on at least 3 occasions. You can only imagine how demented he was returning to a body that was decomposing. He had his reasons, but we'll get to that. Bundy was brazen, there's no doubt about it. He didn't ever think he'd be caught. He thought he was too intelligent for the police. After all, he'd worked in politics. He worked as an assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee, where he wrote a paper on rape prevention. He did a stint at the Department of Emergency Services, where he talked about missing women and how to find them. And that's likely why Bundy didn't have any qualms about returning to the alleyway from where he'd picked up Hawkins. The day after the abduction, he was there at the same time as the police, hiding in plain sight as he picked up one of the girl's shoes and her necklace. If he wasn't picking up girls in a car park or close by one, he was sneaking into basements while they slept and then bludgeoning the victim with some kind of iron bar. Bundy was like the boogeyman, a serial killer that crawled through windows and viciously attacked people while they were at their most vulnerable. But he was also a con artist. He played confidence tricks and he was very good at it. Investigators knew that when girls went missing, at times a man was seen with an arm in a sling, a man that owned a VW Beetle. Surely Bundy was easy prey after that. How many VW Beetles were there in those areas when the abduction happened? Areas dotted around the Pacific Northwest. The reality was Bundy's reign of terror was only in the early stages. The public and police were worried, that's for sure. Young folks stopped hitching rides and many became fearful of talking to strangers or leaving their windows open at night. Those with most to fear were young white women. Bundy's victims were almost always in their late teens or early 20s. They were Caucasian, and most of them were attractive. They studied at university and were said to be intelligent and gifted students. Another thing was the fact that each girl disappeared at a college where construction work was going on. Could the disappearances be linked? Wondered investigators. They just didn't know. They had very little forensic evidence to work with, and there were no bodies. That didn't mean the cops thought the girls had just taken off someplace. Nothing about their personalities and state of mind suggested that. Only weeks after Hawkins went missing, 2 women were abducted in broad daylight at Lake Sammamish State Park, not far from the city of Seattle. Bundy had first approached 5 women in the park, and in what they later described as a Canadian or British accent, the man introduced himself as Ted. Ted, dressed in a pressed white tennis outfit with one arm in a sling, politely asked them if they could help him unload a sailboat from his bronze-colored Volkswagen Beetle. 4 of them said no, but one followed him to his car. Thankfully, she ran away when she became aware that there was no sailboat. That day, Bundy managed to enlist 1 woman for help, and he later abducted another close to a restroom. Both would die. Did he kill one in front of the other? He once said that that was true, but close to his execution date, he recanted that terribly bleak detail. This is not a story about his crimes, though. What we want to know is how the hell did the police not get closer to Bundy, seeing as he was using the same car and the same sling trick, and so the same modus operandi? He even told the girls that escaped that he was named Ted. What more did the cops need? A written confession? They were closer, but still a long way from getting him. They at least now had good description of this Ted guy, and it did quite look like him. In no time at all, this sketch appeared in many newspapers and was shown on TV. Remember that we said Bundy worked at the Department of Emergency Services? Well, one of his co-workers there saw the sketch and heard about the Volkswagen Beetle, and she knew she was looking at her colleague, Mr. Bundy. She made a call to the cops, as did another person that knew Ted Bundy. The cops at the time were receiving something like 200 of these calls in one day, and they quickly assumed that a clean-cut law student with no criminal record couldn't be behind the abductions. Serial killers didn't look like that, or so they thought. The heat was on though, and Bundy knew it. A couple of months after his last murder, bones were being found. Those bones were the remains of his victims, scattered in various places where the cops hadn't thought to look. It was fortunate for Bundy then that he was accepted to study at the University of Utah Law School. He packed his bags and headed south in August of '74. He was only in Utah a month when he started killing again. September 2nd, a hitchhiker. October 2nd, a 16-year-old girl. October 18th, a 17-year-old girl from a pizza parlor. It turned out that she was the daughter of a police chief. After her decomposing body was found on a hiking trail, the post-mortem exam revealed that Bundy had kept her alive for perhaps 7 days. Each had been subjected to the most brutal depravity, although Bundy admitted years later that after he killed them, he shampooed their hair and applied makeup to their faces, keeping them in a state that he liked. He wanted the physical possession of the remains, and he wanted to do what he wanted to them. He sometimes chopped them, sometimes kept heads in his apartment, and he dressed them in the way he wanted them to look. And then he took a photograph. When you work hard to do something right, he once said, you don't want to forget it. More abductions happened, more murders, as well as attempted abductions. The disappearances were reported in the media, and after reading about them, a woman named Elizabeth Klepfer, who dated Bundy back when he was in Washington, put 2 and 2 together. She not only called the King County cops and told them that she thought she had been dating the killer, but she also told the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office and said the same. She was still talking to Bundy at this point on the telephone, but she didn't say anything about her calls. For her, the sketch looked like Ted Bundy. The car was Bundy's, and so the murders following him around were just too much of a coincidence. Bundy started then killing in Colorado. Things didn't change much. Death by blunt force trauma, sometimes strangulation, bodies dumped, mutilated, sometimes wearing clothes that weren't theirs. 1975 drew to an end and there were more victims, some whose bodies have never been found. 76 turned out to be another bloody year, so how come Washington cops weren't at the very least looking at Bundy? They only did that after they discovered a new toy, a computer and a database. They found that they could input data about the murders and the computer would compare that data to data already in the system. Thousands of names were in that database, but only 26 names matched the crimes. Bundy's was one of them. The problem was connecting the Utah and Colorado murders to the Pacific Northwest murders. At the time, there were no large databases containing all the state's police departments. The fact of the matter was, while the cops should have known better after the tip-offs, because Bundy moved around, he managed to evade capture. But then, he was pulled over by a cop in a Salt Lake City suburb after he'd been driving around looking suspicious. On searching Bundy's car, the cop found quite the collection of suspicious items: a ski mask, trash bags, handcuffs, a crowbar, lengths of rope, and an ice pick. All that was pretty much the consummate serial killer's stash. It didn't take long for the cops to understand that they might have a maniac on their hands, and they had the phone call from Bundy's lover in their records, and they had his car description from one of the abductions. Still, after searching his house, the police didn't have enough to keep him. One thing they didn't find that day was a bunch of photographs of his dead victims. Things would have been very different had they discovered those awful snaps. Bundy was on the loose again, but he was being monitored all day long. Some of the cops flew to Seattle to speak to Bundy's lover. She told them that some things just didn't add up, such as why did he keep crutches in his house? And what about that plaster of Paris? Not to mention the surgical gloves, big knives, meat cleaver, and a bag full of women's clothes. Bundy was certainly in a fix now, but he was by no means done. He sold his beloved Beetle, but that was soon sequestered by investigators who gave the interior a good going over. What they found were strands of hair from females, and those females were very likely victims of murder. Police brought Bundy in and put him in a lineup, but they only had enough evidence to possibly put him on trial for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. His parents paid his $15,000 bail and off he went, once again, a free man, but under heavy round-the-clock surveillance. He actually lived with his lover again while he was on bail, which should have been a very strange time for her. At this point, the lead investigators from Utah, Washington, and Colorado all finally got together and shared their stories and what evidence they had. They were pretty darn sure that they had a serial killer on their hands, and an utterly depraved one at that. Before they could get him for murder, though, he faced trial for kidnapping and assault. He was found guilty and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. While in there, he was charged with just one of the murders. Bundy was a desperate man around this time, likely knowing that his crimes or most of them would catch up with him and he'd be looking at the death penalty. He chose to defend himself, and because of that, he didn't have to wear handcuffs or leg shackles in court. On one of those court appearances, he managed to convince the court he needed the library and he leapt from a window. He actually survived for 6 days around the wilderness of the Aspen Mountains, but was eventually picked up by the cops. The case against him for that one murder was actually quite weak, but it seemed that Bundy believed they would get him. If he was done for that case, more cases might follow. Over a period of 6 months, he got his hands on a floor plan of the jail. He saved money after getting it smuggled in by visitors, and he also got himself a hacksaw. On December 30th, 1977, Bundy filled his bed with books, so it might look like he was sleeping. He then got through the ceiling and into an apartment. There, he changed into civilian clothes and then he walked out of the jail. He went from Chicago to Atlanta to Florida in stolen cars, only stopping to steal certain items or wallets from people. On January 15, 1978, he walked around at night in Florida State University. In the early hours of the morning, he assaulted, bludgeoned, strangled, and bit 3 sleeping women in 3 different rooms, all within about 15 minutes. 2 of them survived but were very badly injured. He left the sorority house and went to an apartment building where he viciously attacked another girl, fracturing her skull and jaw. There, he left behind one of his favorite things, his pantyhose mask. Police also found sperm and hair samples. Bundy later drove to Jacksonville where he abducted and killed a 12-year-old girl. A few days later, he was stopped by a police officer. During questioning, he kicked the man's legs and ran for it. The cop fired warning shots, but Bundy kept running. He was too slow, he was tackled, and in spite of his best efforts, he couldn't get the gun from the cop. Bundy was done for, sat in a car, handcuffed, on his way to certain death. Still, this Florida policeman didn't know who he had in the car. He was not aware that he was carrying one of the USA's most wanted fugitives. He certainly had no idea that the occupant of his vehicle would become known as one of the worst, most vile serial killers of all time. A demon whose warped brutality knew no bounds. And do you know what Bundy said to the cop while he was in the car? He said, "I wish you had killed me." Eventually, he confessed to 30 murders, but there could have been many more. On January 24, 1989, age 42, Bundy took his final breaths in the electric chair. His last words were, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." They said he was a pillar of the community. Friendly neighbors watched from their windows as he shoveled snow for the elderly. He became Pogo the Clown for the local children, who guffawed at his tricks and happily received a balloon for being such a good boy or girl. A close friend to politicians and professionals, when the mask finally was removed from this sadistic killer, society was shaken to its very core. John Wayne Gacy was a man who said in custody, "I've taken 3.5 hours of truth serum, sodium amytal, the maximum amount I could have. It shows I have no knowledge of the crime whatsoever." That's strange because his crimes were certainly memorable. When Gacy was not making kids laugh at tricks, he did one-on-one shows in his house that involved asking a young man to wear a pair of handcuffs to try to get out of them. Having already seen that Gacy was a respectable member of the local community, the victim gladly slipped his hands into the cuffs. His captor would then fasten a noose around his neck, pulling it tighter in increments. This was about the time when the victim knew there was no trick, and Gacy was certainly no pillar of the community. But let's go back to the start. Like many serial killers in the making, the young Gacy suffered a troubled upbringing. He stuffed his trauma down into the far reaches of his brain, but it wouldn't be long before his horrifying past resurfaced in new ways when he grew up. Gacy was an outcast as a young boy and had a father who was quick to reprimand the youngster. Gacy was powerless. This doesn't often bode well for the adult in the making. But at the age of 18, it looked as though Gacy was doing all right. That's when he became the assistant precinct captain for a local Democratic Party politician. It seemed like young Gacy was becoming a respectable young man. Still, he could never do any good in his father's eyes. His pop, an ugly human if there ever was one, was often calling his son sissy boy and other similar slurs. John Wayne Gacy was homosexual, but you can understand why he tried his hardest to repress his sexual urges and feelings with a father like that. A leading detective on the case will say Gacy was actually a homophobic homosexual, his denial being so strong. Gacy moved away from his father and ended up working as a mortuary assistant in Las Vegas. There he took perhaps a too keen interest in the embalming of bodies. One day he got into a coffin of a recently deceased man. He hugged the body, he stroked the slick embalmed skin. For those few moments he didn't feel powerless at all. He then jumped out of the coffin in a state of shock. With actual living young men becoming intimate posed more problems. Even though Gacy got married, it was just a charade. When he became a manager at a KFC outlet, he'd often invite young male workers back to his house to play pool and drink alcohol. He'd usually come on to them, and when they pushed him away, he'd just say he was kidding. The guys usually weren't gay. And even if they were, Gacy was hardly attractive. His solution to those unreciprocated advances was simple and vile. Abduct them first, torture them, and kill them. He did this many times, and it seems he did so without so much as stirring anyone's curiosity. He was, after all, a community leader, an organizer of parades, a successful businessman and fundraiser whose mask remained tight against his doughy face. He was, as people later said, the devil in disguise. But let's be frank here, viewers. Had any of you more discerning people known Gacy back then and really talked to him, you'd have known he was screwy in about 20 minutes. If you'd hung around him for a few weeks, you'd likely have seen his massive stash of pornography. There's nothing wrong with that, of course, but you'd have to notice that he spent as much time hanging out with guys in their late teens as he did with his wife and children. You'd then have found out that he had two clown characters, Pogo, the nice clown, and Patches, the sometimes devilish clown. You wouldn't have had to read Sigmund Freud to figure out that this was a two-sided man. Sometimes he'd keep the clown outfit on, and you'd later see him collapsed over a beer in a local bar. Had you not come to the conclusion by then that Mr. Gacy might have been hiding something perhaps a little dark, your intuitive faculties were as dull as a potato's. But you didn't even need heightened intuition to see what he was like. He sexually harassed a number of his staff, all young men. He once told one of them, "Do you know how easy it would be to get one of my guns and kill you, and how easy it would be to get rid of the body?" You might have even seen how young men went into his house and never came out. You could have talked with a young man who Gacy tried to handcuff, likely with the intent to kill, only to be out-wrestled. Gacy told that guy, "Not only are you the only one who got out of the cuffs, you got them on me." There were other survivors too. If you were a young guy back then living anywhere near that neighborhood, you would have heard of Mr. Gacy, the creepy clown who couldn't keep his hands to himself. If you'd been able to look deeper, you would have seen he served time in prison for assault on a young man. So this begs the question, how come he wasn't investigated? It was partly because people back then, even the police, didn't expect serial killers to look from the outside as upstanding members of the community. Gacy wasn't just a pillar of the community, he was the lodestone, especially once he'd gotten his painting, decorating, and maintenance business off the ground. His political work even got him a photograph with the First Lady Rosalind Carter. If there was a serial killing university degree, the first thing you learn in evasion tactics class is that if you want to become a prime wolf, you first have to know how to perfect playing the lamb. It also helps to earn money, since money and power afford a killer cloaking device. Ask the United States Secret Service, which gave Gacy special clearance. Okay, let's now get down to the business of how he was finally caught. On December 11th, 1978, a woman named Elizabeth Peist went to the local drugstore to pick up her teenage son who worked there. She was in great spirits that day. It was her birthday, and she had invited all her friends to her party. The devoted son Robert had helped her get things ready for the party. Robert told his mom to wait in the parking lot. He said he just had to speak to a guy about a possible summer job, a job that paid a whole lot more than his drugstore gig. All Miss Pice was told was that the guy offering the job worked in construction. Robert had met him when the guy went to the drugstore to talk about possible maintenance. Elizabeth sat in the car, giddy about the party to come and glad her son was helping out with making sure everything went well. But then 20 minutes passed and he still hadn't come out of the store. She never saw him again. She couldn't enjoy the party that evening with her son still not having contacted her. Not even a phone call just to say he got waylaid. Later that night, when everyone had left, she called the police and reported Robert missing, informing them about the contractor he said he was meeting. The cops soon discovered that the contractor was 36-year-old John Wayne Gacy. This guy was known to almost everyone in the community. In 3 different cities, he'd been voted Man of the Year by the Junior Chamber of Commerce. He had a successful business and had even met the president's wife. When the cops looked more into the man, they found out he often visited the local hospital children's ward. There, playing Pogo the Clown to seriously ill kids, he bounced around doing tricks. One was handcuffing the kids and then pretending he'd lost the key and telling them they'd stay that way forever. Another was running around and tying them up with rope. The children couldn't get enough of it. When police interviewed his neighbors, they told him Gacy was a lovely guy, despite going through 2 divorces and not seeing his 2 kids much. Every Christmas, his house was always the one with the most Christmas lights. When it snowed, he never failed to go out in the street and shovel old folks' driveways. So police didn't immediately think, serial killing sadist. In fact, they might have left Gacy alone had he not denied going to the drugstore that day Robert went missing. Witnesses had put him there. This encouraged the cops to dig a little deeper. They only had to scrape the surface to find the part-time party clown had been imprisoned in the past for attacking a teenager. They also saw that similar charges had been dropped in another case that mirrored that one. What was just as shocking was a police report from 1978, which Gacy had invited a 28-year-old man to smoke some weed in his car. He told police at the time that Gacy knocked him out by putting a rag soaked in chloroform over his mouth. Gacy took him back to his house and assaulted him. Police didn't charge Gacy, and the matter was settled over a $3,000 payout. Now, a few months later, he'd been connected to a missing teen. Police had to investigate. Too many things just seemed wrong about Gacy. Police got a warrant and went to search his house. They found all kinds of books and films related to sex, a starting pistol, a length of nylon rope, drugs that can make someone sleepy, police badges, and if that wasn't suspicious enough, lots of IDs and underwear that did not belong to Gacy. In his bedroom was a giant clown painting. Close to that was a TV alarm clock and radio, unbeknownst to cops, something that had belonged to one of his victims. On closer inspection, police found their pièce de résistance, a drugstore receipt in a wastebasket that had one point been in Robert Pice's pocket. They didn't know this just yet. Police also found a class of 1975 Maine West High School ring. On it was the initials JAS. They didn't know it at the time, but the ring belonged to one of Gacy's former employees, John Allen Syke, who became a victim himself. They surveilled his house after that and followed him everywhere he went. Gacy seemed to enjoy this at first, going over to the police car outside his house and telling the cops where he was about to go. As time went on, he said the police were harassing him for no good reason, all the time trying to prove how important he was. One time, detectives went to lunch with Gacy. They asked him about his clown thing. Gacy said he loved being Pogo. Being a clown, he said, meant you could go out in public and grab women, and all they did was laugh about it. He told them being a clown, you can get away with murder. Police then interviewed one of his former employees, who told them Gacy once asked him to spread lime in a crawl space under his house. That's when they started working on getting a second search warrant. One day, Gacy lost his temper and went out to the surveillance vehicle. He said to the cops, "Come inside, have a coffee, look around, there's nothing to see." Meanwhile, the neighbors wondered why those horrible cops were harassing poor Mr. Gacy. In the house, one of the cops noticed something when he flushed the toilet. It wasn't physical, it was a smell every detective knows well: death. That second warrant couldn't come soon enough. Soon after, Gacy turned up at his lawyer's office looking rattled and drunk. He told his lawyers he had something to say. When they asked what, he pulled out the newspaper, pointing at the article about the missing boy Robert Pice. Gacy said, "The boy's dead. He's dead. He's in a river." Through the night, the drunk Gacy said he'd been the jury, judge, and executioner of many, many people. He said some were under the house and others were in the river, although Gacy was worse for wear throughout his rambling. He wasn't under arrest at this point and so left, now badly hungover. He wouldn't remain a free man long, but while he was, he drove over to meet a friend and said, "I've been a bad boy. I killed 30 people, give or take a few." On December 21st, police got the second warrant to search his house. As they looked around, they found a kind of trap door. That led to a crawl space, so one of the detectives got in and started crawling along the tunnel. His nostrils were immediately filled with the stench of decomposition. He shouted up to the other detectives, "I think this place is full of kids." At first, police found 3 bodies, all in various stages of rot. They also found bits of bodies. What they were looking at was perhaps one of the USA's worst serial killers. Turned out Gacy had been killing for a while, even when he was living with his second wife. Once she was out of the house, he lured young men back to his place on the promise of booze and weed. He'd often play his clown game with them, strapping handcuffs over their wrists to see if they could get out. They'd become worried, and then he would strangle them. He usually did this slowly, first by putting the rope around their neck and telling them it too was a game. He gradually fastened it tighter and tighter by twisting a stick until they could hardly breathe. He tortured some of his victims while they were in this state of terminal distress. His wife would often complain about the horrid smell, to which Gacy would always blame dead rats. When she complained too much, he told her to mind her own business. She asked about all the clothes and wallets she found, seemingly from the young men. Again, Gacy told her not to pry into his personal business. That's when she left. Police interviewed survivors, mostly poor kids and prostitutes he found on the streets. Although Gacy was open to picking up any kind of hitchhiker, he'd take them back to his house and show them that photo of himself with the First Lady. This was usually enough to make the men feel safe. The only reason they survived was that they outright refused to play the handcuff game with him. They didn't tell the cops, for the sad fact that most of them saw police as the enemy. If they did take part in the trick, they died. Gacy told police that when he was tightening that rope around his victim's neck, for the final time he would often recite the 23rd Psalm. It starts with the line, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And later comes the unforgettable line, "Yea, I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." God knows what might have been going through the minds of his victims. Gacy was doing most of the killing when he was the most famous for playing pogo, so he could have killed and entertained a bunch of sick kids or the children of his politician friends. As for why he did it, Gacy once told FBI profiler Robert Ressler that all his victims were just worthless little queers and punks. He later denied the murders, saying he'd been set up. In his many interviews, he said the media made him into some kind of monster. He said, "They've created this fantasy monster image, and it's been going on for the last 12 years, and I never had no comment. And I had no need to talk to the media for the simple reason that they were looking for sensationalism. They were looking for the monster." It wasn't exactly a cogent defense, seeing as a mass of bodies were found under his house and their belongings inside of his house. In a separate interview, Gacy said, "If you want to say I slept in the house of a dead body, okay, fine, I'll buy that. But in the same room? No. And besides, the dead won't bother you, it's the living you gotta worry about." He once created a document winning correspondence to the New Yorker. It was a Q&A which he answered himself. Here are some of the answers, just to give you more insight into how he either fooled himself or was an outright liar. "My biggest regret, being so trusting and gullible, taken advantage of. Favorite song, Send in the Clowns, Amazing Grace. I consider myself liberal with values." Gacy told the interviewer he hadn't committed the murders. He said at one point, "I'll tell you what, I'm not gonna make no damn Ted Bundy's last-minute confessions." The interviewer didn't expect him to, nor did he believe much of what Gacy had said over many hours of chats. Gacy should have been caught much earlier, or at least should have set off a few lights in the radar of the local police departments. In 1975, an 18-year-old former employee of Gacy named John Butkovich had an argument with him over some missing pay. Butkovich went missing after that. Gacy was interviewed by the cops, but nothing came of it. Remember, this was a man with a very sketchy record of hurting young men. The boy's parents called the cops over 100 times, each time demanding that they investigate Gacy. They didn't. Gacy later told police that he got Butkovich stoned and drunk and then inveigled him to put the handcuffs on behind his back. Gacy said he sat on him for at least an hour before strangling him. He then had to rush to bury the body since his wife and kids said they were coming back. During the trial, the prosecutor said John Gacy has accounted for more human devastation than many earthly catastrophes, but one must tremble. I tremble when thinking about just how close he came to getting away with it all. That is true. He could have gotten away with so many murders. Maybe it was his political connections and air of importance that helped him escape the eyes of the police. That and the fact that he was Man of the Year. There was also linkage blindness, meaning different police departments didn't or couldn't link up his earlier offenses. Still, maybe Gacy wasn't working alone. An investigator later said there was overwhelming evidence Gacy worked with an accomplice. He could have also been part of some depraved ring, which is what many people now think. There's fairly convincing evidence that he was involved with a man who operated such a ring. Gacy was convicted of 33 murders in all. On May 10, 1994, he received a lethal injection. He had no last words, although some dubious sources state he said, "Kiss my..." You need to fill in that final word yourself. cursing offends some people. Richard Ramirez, aka the Night Stalker, sits in court after being sentenced to death. He growls, "You maggots make me sick." He composes himself and goes on, "You don't understand me. You're not expected to. I will be avenged. Lucifer dwells in all of us." That's one reason this man was called evil. He was a serial killer that seemed to accept he was evil, perhaps doing the devil's bidding. He also seemed to relish his celebrity status, much like other maniacal serial killers such as Ted Bundy. One of the categories that serial killers sometimes fall into is the missionary type. Murderers who, for some messed up reason, think they're doing the work of a higher power. They would usually say they're working for God, cleaning up the streets, getting rid of human garbage, etc. But Ramirez seemed to think Satan had hired him. Hired for what, you might wonder? More of his ranting in court might explain that, if not entirely, given the magnitude of his madness. He said, "I don't believe in the hypocritical moralistic dogmas of this so-called society. I need to look beyond this room to see the liars, haters, the killers, the crooks, the paranoid cowards, truly trematodes of the earth, each one in his own legal profession." If you're wondering what a trematode is, it's a kind of parasite. Ramirez blasted society for what he saw as hypocrisy, saying there are those that kill for policy, clandestinely or openly, as do governments of the world, which kill in the name of God or country. Okay, Richard, some people might have thought back then. Maybe you're right, and the governments of the world in the name of imperialism and economic power have done some rotten things, but how does that excuse what you have done, namely some of the worst crimes in the history of the USA? Now let's go back a few years. On June 28, 1984, a 79-year-old woman named Jenny Vincow was found dead in her apartment in northeast Los Angeles. Police believe she'd been sleeping when an intruder entered the property and attacked her with a knife. The assault had been so brutal that cops didn't immediately think it was a break-in gone wrong. The killer had made a point to be excessive. Ramirez didn't strike again until almost a year later. That was when he shot 22-year-old Maria Hernandez. She survived, but her roommate didn't. Less than 1 hour later, he shot and killed a 30-year-old woman. 2 murders and 1 attempted murder in the space of an hour, even in violent LA, was a big deal. The press reported that some kind of ghoul was lurking in the night hours, describing him as having rotten teeth and bulging eyes. Some called him the Valley Intruder in the media, a boogeyman if there ever was one. He was just getting started. 10 days later, he killed a married couple, Vincent and Maxine Zazzara. When police arrived at the scene, they found Maxine's body mutilated with the eyes removed. The same kind of gun in the previous murders had been used, but now they had another clue. That was a footprint in a flower bed made by a pair of sneakers. Brand? Avia. About a month and a half later, he killed another couple. 2 weeks later, he attacked 2 sisters, both in their 80s. He beat them viciously with a hammer and even used an electrical cord to torture one of them. Amazingly, they both survived, although one of the women died soon after from injuries. This time, the intruder had left another clue. He'd used some lipstick he found in the house to scrawl a satanic pentagram on the bedroom walls. He'd also drawn a pentagram on one of his victims' thighs. Just 1 day later, he entered the home of a woman and her 11-year-old son. This time, he left no dead bodies, although while attacking the woman, he shouted at her, "Don't look at me or I'll cut out your eyes." One time, he was trying to strangle the victim using a telephone cord when he thought he saw electrical sparks appear. He later said he left that woman alone after that, believing that Jesus had made his presence known and acted on her behalf. Did he really believe that? We think he probably did. With another victim he had tied up, he demanded to know where all the valuables in the house were. He screamed at her to tell the truth, saying, "Swear on Satan." He did that the same night he killed another elderly woman. Footprints were found on her battered face. They could be traced back to a pair of Avia sneakers. 2 weeks later, he used a machete and a gun to kill another elderly married couple. Again, he took many valuables from the house. Okay, so what were the police looking at? In terms of criminal profiles, this case was a little bit unusual in the sense that the serial killer stole from the victims. Many serial killers have no interest whatsoever in monetary gain. The act of killing is psychosexual. The impetus is gratification, not having cash to spend on new things. Then there were the satanic symbols and the talk about Satan. Ramirez had also signed one of his murder scenes with a Jack the Knife, perhaps in relation to the infamous Jack the Ripper. Like the never-caught Jack in London, this killer wanted recognition for his crimes. But in the terminology of the FBI profilers, the LA killer didn't seem to be organized, or at least not very organized. Organized killers like Ted Bundy usually have studied police tactics and go to great pains to avoid arrest. They're often quite bright and can be the guy next door with a good job rather than street-hustling heavy drug users like Ramirez. If Ramirez was what criminologists call forensically aware, he sometimes didn't show it. He left footprints behind when a more astute killer would have known not to do that. He also was seen by some of his victims and he let them live. According to the FBI's serial killer catching folks, named the Behavioral Sciences Unit, think Silence of the Lambs, this killer didn't really fit into any kind of category. He was a bit of everything. He obviously got off on having power over victims. He was no doubt a sadist, given how he tortured some of them, but he was also a two-bit thief. On top of that, serial killers, at least the organized type, usually planned their murders, sometimes meticulously. With this killer, it was as if he was going on some kind of mad rampage. His crimes came one after the other. Another of them involved Ramirez entering a family home. He killed the man immediately, and after viciously attacking the woman, again he made her swear on Satan as he asked her where all the valuables were kept. In this case, he didn't just not attack the child, but he sent him to a neighbor where he said he'd be safe. Police then got a break. Yet again, after another attack, they found a footprint, and it was almost certainly from a pair of Avia shoes. Detectives discovered that this particular style wasn't all that common in the US, which was great for the case. They found out that very few pairs of that style shipped in the US were size 11.5. In fact, to get that size in LA was almost impossible, given that only one store in the city had received a pair. They could also link the crimes with ballistic evidence. But there's a good reason the police didn't tell the press or anyone about their leads. The reason, of course, is if matters of their investigation get out, the killer will be tipped off. Goes without saying that most killers follow their crimes on the news. Sure, police release sketches of criminals because the public can come forward if they think they know the person, but cops also hold a lot back. One reason is not to tip the criminal off, and another is so during interrogation, the accused might say something only the perpetrator could possibly know. In this case, the then mayor of San Francisco, Dianne Feinstein, held a press conference and talked about the shoes and the caliber of the gun. Without a doubt, Mayor Feinstein made a big mistake, a detective later said. The mistake was about as foolish as the Nazis publicly releasing the details of their up-and-coming blitzkrieg. So, what did Ramirez do after watching that on the TV? Of course, he got rid of the shoes, taking them to the Golden Gate Bridge and throwing them down into the water. This was a massive setback for the cops. Imagine they'd have arrested Ramirez with a matching gun and a pair of shoes that were pretty much the four-leaf clover of footwear. Feinstein, by the way, had been told about the details of the LA crimes because of a similar crime in San Francisco, but she wasn't meant to talk about the details in public. She did at least do some things right. One was stating the obvious. She said this is a very serious situation. The killer goes into a home at night and kills at random. Somewhere in the Bay Area, someone is renting a room, an apartment, or a home to this vicious serial killer. Still, Ramirez was a bit stupid because he didn't throw away the gun like just about every detective thought he would. About a week later, he was skulking outside another family home, this time in Orange County. He was chased away, but the man of the house could describe to the cops the car and part of the license number. He had no idea it was the car of the Night Stalker. That same night, Ramirez entered another house and shot a man in the head 3 times. He tied up the man's wife, beating her and telling her to repeat to him that she loved Satan. He left her alive and told her to inform police, tell them the Night Stalker was here. The man actually survived after surgery. Police not only found another footprint, but despite Ramirez's best efforts to clean his dumped stolen car, a fingerprint was taken from the rearview mirror. What Ramirez didn't know is that California had recently acquired a new machine. That was a $25 million computer system with the name Cal ID. Police could run a fingerprint through that, and it would be matched with fingerprints from other crimes. This was pretty high-tech back in those days. While it's said that this solved the case, it isn't strictly true. Police already had a bunch of leads from all the stuff that Ramirez had stolen from his many victims. He'd fenced them on the streets, and some of the items police had a trail on. The person that had sold them, they were told, was named Ricardo, or perhaps just Rick. Cops then released the mugshot of Ramirez that had been taken after he was arrested for stealing a car in 1984. They also issued a statement saying, "We know who you are now, and soon everyone else will. There will be no place you can hide." They knew they were looking for a 25-year-old drifter from Texas with a history of drug use. What they didn't know is that this kid had witnessed a murder when young, and on top of other traumas, he was a pretty messed up youngster. Not that many people knew Ramirez because he was mostly a loner who moved around taking drugs wherever he could find them. Alone at home, he watched just about every variety of slasher movie when he wasn't listening to Black Sabbath, AC/DC, and post-Sabbath Ozzy Osbourne. We won't criticize his music choices, but for Ramirez, listening to dark tunes was a way to rebel against his violent father and a very religious mother. Mix in a bit of LSD, amphetamine, and PCP and sprinkle on that the murder he saw and maybe some more violence. And as one serial killer author put it, by the time Ramirez was 17, his brain was seriously fried. Ramirez moved on to cocaine through the main line, and at times when high, he would read the Satanic Bible and attend satanic rituals. After that, he started killing. He was now in hiding, although he hadn't checked the news and had no idea countless people had seen his photograph. His face was plastered over just about every front-page newspaper in California, but he didn't know that when he got on a bus heading to see his brother in Arizona. If he'd only gone to a newspaper stand, he would have seen his face staring back at him. This guy was walking around when the vast majority of people wouldn't have minded lynching him. He managed at one point to walk past some cops who were looking for him, and then he walked into a convenience store. The thing was, a group of elderly women had seen him. They were almost shaking, saying to each other, "El Matador," the killer in Spanish. Inside the store, things had changed for Ramirez. That's because he now saw in front of him newspapers showing his face. He walked back outside where there were more people pointing at him. He made a run for it, sprinting across the freeway and then unsuccessfully trying to steal a car. He ran some more, jumping over garden fences, and tried again to steal a car. Now helicopters were buzzing overhead. Ramirez managed to get inside one car whose occupant was Angie de la Torre. He punched her in the stomach and got hold of the keys. But her 57-year-old neighbor, Jose Burgoyne, was soon on the scene. This is what Burgoyne later told the media. "I ran to defend her, and he told me, 'Don't get closer or I'll shoot you.' I didn't see a gun, so I opened the door and pulled him out of the car." More people arrived on the scene, and it was mayhem. The Night Stalker was now a daytime brawler, and he wasn't so good at it. De la Torre's husband turned up, and he furiously whacked Ramirez over the head with what he described as a barbecue utensil. Ramirez fled again, only to be chased down the street that was starting to look like the Gauntlet in a version of Mexican-American gladiators, where the weapons of choice were not made out of soft rubber. Someone hit Ramirez over the head with a fence post, and that was it. He was down. The jostling crowd now laid into him and beat him badly. He might have received a public execution there and then had some folks not held back and the police intervened. Ramirez was later given a date with the gas chamber. As often happens with serial killers, women sent him fan mail while he was in prison. He even married a woman during his incarceration. The Night Stalker never was killed by the state, dying instead from complications due to B-cell lymphoma in 2013. He was 53. The year is 1894, and police in Chicago enter a building known as the Murder Castle. That day, the cops find rooms with movable walls. They discover chutes in those rooms that lead to a basement where vats of acid could turn a human body into mush. Around the entire building are a labyrinth of corridors, some that lead nowhere. Some of the hallways contain rooms that have vents built into them, where noxious gases can be released. Down in the basement are the grisliest discoveries, an operating table where bodies have been dissected, and worse, a kind of stretching rack where one could perform the most diabolical experiments. This shocking discovery would open the floodgates to the discovery of the atrocities committed by Mr. Henry Howard Holmes, real-life Saw villain and one of America's most evil serial killers. And this is how it all unraveled. He wasn't born Henry Howard Holmes, he made that name up later in an effort to distance himself from his dastardly deeds. He was actually born with the name Herman Webster Mudgett. On May 16, 1861, he became the third child of Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodot Page Pritz, English immigrants living in New Hampshire. As a kid, he excelled in school, which landed him a place at the respectable Phillips Exeter Academy. He graduated, he took work as a teacher, he married young and had a child. This was a young man that seemed destined to live a quiet life within the middle classes of the American public. But something happened, and darkness encroached on the young man's life. Age 18, now with wife and child, he enrolled at the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. He graduated and was said to be a brilliant student, if not a person with some strange inclinations. It was while studying in the anatomy department at this university that he began his life of crime. The crimes were simple, if not macabre. He worked in the anatomy department of the college, a job that gave him access to bodies that were to be dissected. Some of those cadavers he sneaked out of the department and bashed them around a bit, making it look like they died in an accident. Prior to doing this, the young student had taken out insurance policies on those people. You'd think this would not be so easy to do, even back then, but it's alleged he committed this scam on quite a few occasions. He had cash in his pocket, a wife, and an infant child. But it seems he wasn't interested in staying settled down for long. One day, he just took off, leaving the two behind, and they would not see him again for a very long time. Just before he left, he created a highly fictitious story that he knew would get back to them. They heard from others that he'd been in some kind of train accident and lost his memory. As outlandish as it seems, it kind of worked, and such lies would work again for him in the future. He ended up in New York State, and while there he was connected to the disappearance of a young boy. Did he kill the boy? It's now thought he did, but no one can be sure. He also tried to scam an insurance company out of $20,000 by using another cadaver he'd taken a policy out on, but this time he was caught. He was now getting quite the name for himself, so naturally, he changed his name. Herman Webster Mudgett became H.H. Holmes. It was at this point that he moved to Chicago, a place where his name would be cemented in history. He married again, illegally of course since he hadn't divorced, and he started to make plans for future scams. He made sure to marry into a wealthy family. He was obviously well-educated, well-spoken, and you could say he had the gift of gab. That's why he was always able to secure loans to buy properties. To pay those loans back, he got loans on the properties he already had. He bit off more than he could chew, but when creditors went after him, he always seemed to get himself out of the fix. One of the ways he did this was to move around a bit, and so now we come to one of the most recognized addresses in crime history, that of 63rd and Wallace Streets, where he worked as a clerk in a drugstore that was on the bottom floor. With some cunning, he managed to take it over, and once that was done, he took over much of the building. This was a massive place with rows of stores at the bottom and apartments on the third floor. Then there was a second floor where Holmes would create his house of horrors. And as you know, the basement is where the very ugly stuff went on. He was still scamming, of course, selling from his drugstore magical drinks that could allegedly stop alcoholism in its tracks. He sold a Canadian man an invention for $2,000, although the gas-making machine wasn't what it seemed. He also sold water that he said was a cure for every ailment, which was water Holmes was stealing from the water mains. Suffice to say, this man knew his way around industrial piping. This would help him later when he gassed people to death. Holmes never stopped working on his building, telling people that he was creating a hotel for the soon-to-arrive World's Fair. In truth, he was creating a monster of a building that didn't make any sense. He'd hire contractors and then fire them partway through the job. He was creating a house of many doors, landings, and rooms that just didn't look like anything anyone had ever seen. You could walk down one hallway and it would just end. Rooms had no doors. Others had trapdoors. How did he get away with not paying all the people to build this horror castle? The answer is he'd lie through his teeth. And when that didn't work, he changed the names on the ownership documents. Fictitious people owned the building, as did a fictitious company run by people that didn't exist. His mother-in-law even owned the place at one point. It was at this point in time that Holmes began killing people in that building. There was his assistant, Julia, who was with child and husband when she started working in the drugstore. She began an affair with Holmes, so her husband took off. She and her child one day went missing and were never seen again. There were other women who Holmes's wife didn't know about since she didn't live at the castle with him. Holmes could meet someone on the street, use his gift of speech to impress them, and within no time at all, found themselves staying in a weird room on the second floor. Holmes had learned a thing or two while building the monstrosity. He fitted alarms around the building, so when someone opened a door or stepped on a certain step in his room, he'd hear a bell ring. He'd then know they were on the move. Many rooms could be locked only from the outside, so when one of those rooms started to fill with poisonous gas, the occupant would not be able to get out. It's also alleged that one person was burned to death in a room whose walls had been made from fireproof material. There were other rooms that once the door had been closed, they became almost airless, so within a matter of time the victim would be suffocated. After such an event took place, Holmes could easily get the body down to the basement, since the room had been fitted with a chute. Other rooms were connected to small elevators. Sometimes he might have just locked a door and let that person die of dehydration. Years later, he admitted he starved a woman in that room. When the bodies hit the dissecting table, Holmes would go to work on them. Having worked in the medical profession, he knew very well that organs and other body parts were expensive and in high demand. He would take what he wanted from the bodies and throw the waste into vats of lime or acid. He might have done something much worse, too. Okay, so surely someone must have been onto him. This was a man with a lot of skeletons in his closets, possibly literally as well as figuratively. But first, you need to know that during the time Holmes had met a man in Chicago named Benjamin F. Pitzel. Pitzel was no stranger to crime himself, but the jury's still out on whether these two became partners in crime. Holmes then met and married a woman named Minnie Williams. He was actually married to 3 women now, and there'd also be a 4th. After marrying Williams, he managed to get her to sign the deed to her property to a man that was just another alias of Holmes. The deed would eventually be signed over to another man who was an alias of Pitzel. And if that all looks suspicious, it was. Minnie's sister Annie went to Chicago to meet her sister and her mysterious new husband, and neither she nor her sister were ever seen again. They both likely became unwitting organ donors. To cover his tracks, Holmes wrote a letter to the girl's aunt signed by Annie that said things were going swimmingly and she and her sister were heading off to Europe. An actual, real letter was written much earlier to Minnie from Annie. In that missive, Minnie wrote that she'd met a man named Harry Gordon, whom she described as handsome, wealthy, and highly intelligent. Holmes would later tell cops that Minnie had killed Annie after the two of them had vied for his attention, but it's unlikely this was the case. What we know for sure is that Holmes had many relationships, some with the 150 young women who worked for him during those years. It's also true that when the World's Fair came to Chicago, there were a lot of missing persons cases. In 1893, things started to come undone for Holmes. He ripped off too many creditors, and some of them were after him. For that reason, he tried to claim on insurance for a fire at the building, which he actually started himself. The police now knew this guy had a bad reputation, and one investigator named F.G. Cowie looked into Holmes's past. The conclusion of the cop was something seemed awfully wrong about this educated fella. In 1894, Holmes already fled Chicago to go live in the house he'd scammed out of the Williams sisters. While there, he was jailed for trying to commit another scam. While in that jail, he told a man about a plan he had to take out a life insurance policy on himself and then fake his own death. He needed the guy's help, and if that was forthcoming, he'd cut the guy in on the scam. In the end, faking his own death didn't work and the other criminal didn't receive any money. It was then that Holmes turned to Pitzel again for help. He told him that he should fake his death. The plan was for Holmes to create an inventor named B.F. Perry, who was actually Pitzel. This guy would die in a lab experiment gone wrong, but the body that police would find would be a cadaver that Holmes had acquired. After that, Holmes and Pitzel would collect on the life insurance policy. Except Holmes, being Holmes, didn't want to share the loot, so one day he turned up at Pitzel's house, knocked him out with chloroform, and burned his body, making it look like an explosion had happened in the lab. Holmes was then in the money because he'd actually taken out a life insurance policy on the real Pitzel. Holmes went to Mrs. Pitzel's house and told her that her husband was doing some business in London, England. He told her that he could help take care of her 5 kids, of which 3 left that day with Holmes. The kids were never seen again. Holmes later said he forced 2 of them to get inside a large trunk. Once they were in, he made a hole and pumped gas in there through a hose. Not long after, an investigator was on the lookout for Holmes and the 3 missing kids. The cops discovered the remains of the girls at the house where Holmes was staying, and they found teeth and some chopped up bits of the boy in the chimney. The game was almost up. Investigators now started to put this man's life under a microscope. It didn't take long to understand that many people had gone missing who'd been unfortunate enough to cross his path. It's then they went to the castle and they made those grisly discoveries. What's worse, they found what looked like a rack. It was assumed by some that Holmes had used it to torture people into telling him what he wanted to know. It was also understood that for a while Holmes had been working on a theory. He believed that if you slowly stretched a body, it would become taller over time. He wrote that by doing this, humans could create a race of giants. It'll never be known if he actually stretched some of his victims in an attempt to see if he was right. On October 28, 1895, Holmes represented himself for the first day of his trial. It was said that he showed a remarkable familiarity with the law. Still, today a lot is uncertain about his crimes and his motives. The biggest number put forward is that he killed 200 people, although it's certain that he killed 9. He confessed to 27 murders, but then again, he told a lot of lies. May 7, 1896, the day of his execution by hanging. Holmes was said to have looked very calm. His neck didn't break immediately, so his body twitched for a good 15 minutes. After 20 minutes, he was pronounced dead. As for his final words, not long before he departed this world, he had asked if he could be buried deep under concrete. He was worried someone might steal his body and sell his organs. Veteran surgeons said he hacked around inside people's bodies like a hyperactive child wielding a scalpel. He left people paralyzed, he cut through arteries and didn't seem to care as blood flowed like a fountain. He maimed and killed and he was still allowed to operate. How on earth did this happen? That's what we're going to find out today. Christopher Dunch's surgeries were so bad, so utterly disturbing in their seemingly pathological neglect of human life and human suffering, that some people who witnessed his surgical disasters thought he must have been a sociopathic imposter. But Mr. Dunch was a real surgeon. It wasn't as if he'd gotten his qualifications from the University of the Spaghetti Monster degree mill. He wasn't a complete imposter, but as you'll see, he was a sociopath. Dunch was born in Montana in 1971 and was brought up in Memphis, Tennessee. He and his 3 siblings were well taken care of. Their pop, a physical therapist, and mom, the teacher, gave their children everything they needed. Importantly though, Christopher was the eldest sibling. He had something to prove to Nathan, Matt, and Liz, and his parents. He wasn't lacking in talent in high school, being quite smart and showing a fairly high degree of skill in football. In fact, that's what he wanted to do at first, play football. But in college, even though he seemed to train harder than many of the other players, he just didn't cut the mustard. That was failure number one. The buds of his insecurity started growing, and they were filled with poison. It's true that he attained an undergraduate degree in 1995 from Memphis State University. It's also true that he enrolled at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center to take on a difficult qualification that combined an MD and a PhD. He then did a neurosurgical residency, but something went wrong there. Instead of completing the usual 1,000 operations that are usually undertaken, he did around 100, although he was there for 5 years. So on paper, it was looking as though Dunch was doing everything right, despite the lack of training. He could now put an MD on his resume, but he also later added a doctorate in microbiology from St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. St. Jude didn't even run that program. Success was more important than telling the truth. That was becoming evident. He also raised millions of dollars for research regarding stem cells and their application for curing injury and disease, and on the back of 2 Russian scientists' research, he created 2 companies. The husband of the husband and wife team of Russian scientists would later say in regard to the discoveries, "It wasn't his invention, it was the invention of me and my wife, because we all made primary experiments. We discovered it." By the time he started hacking at people's spines, he had a CV that was 12 pages long. To some that looked at it, they thought, what hasn't this guy done? He'd studied, worked in research, and trained for around 15 years. He seemed vastly employable. Little did most people know that Christopher Dunch could add to that CV, perhaps in the hobbies and interests section, avid consumer of recreational drugs with preference for LSD and cocaine, especially cocaine. Dunch, often with a childhood pal Jerry Summers, would get high all night and then he'd go to work with his mind adequately frazzled while wearing dirty scrubs. Summers put his neck on the line for Dunch many times, in the figurative sense, and once, unfortunately, in the literal sense. Dr. Death went to work on Summers' neck injury that left the best friend a quadriplegic. Summers trusted him, but he had no idea his buddy was far from the outstanding surgeon he pretended to be. From his wheelchair, Summers later said, "Before my surgery, I didn't know any bad outcomes that he had." A real surgeon later remarked on the surgery saying Jerry Summers was effectively decapitated during the operation. He died in 2021 as a result of his condition. It's now time we talked more about Dunch's horrific operations. He was forced out of his company and then sued. He was now in debt. He also had a significant problem with the devil's dandruff, so he used that qualification-spangled CV to land himself a job as a neurosurgeon at the Baylor Regional Medical Center. His salary was $600,000 a year. The problem was, as you know, but they didn't know, he wasn't really qualified to work on spines. Nonetheless, a vascular surgeon named Randall Kirby, who'd later file a complaint against Dunch, said all he heard Dunch do was brag about how great a surgeon he was. It was as if he talked a good game but played a very bad one. Kenneth Fennell was Dunch's first patient. He was left paralyzed and was only able to walk a short distance with a cane after a lot of rehabilitation. The operation wasn't a difficult one at all for a qualified surgeon. With patient Lee Passmore, Dunch cut through a ligament that was way off where he should have been cutting. He also put a screw in the wrong place, which he twisted so much he stripped the thread so he couldn't take it back out. When Passmore's 2 young kids and his friend turned up at the hospital and aired their concern, Dunch looked at him and said, "Don't worry about it." Passmore now says he has no feeling in his feet, and there are times when he's incontinent. People who were there for the operation could not believe what they'd seen. But hey, this was a new guy with that amazing CV. We won't go into every patient, but suffice to say, Dunch was dangerous. He used the wrong surgical tools and hacked at nerves and bones. He cut through a major artery in one woman and blood spouted into the air. He was told she might die during the operation, but he just carried on as if nothing happened. The patient did eventually die. Something like this might happen once in a lifetime for a surgeon, but it wouldn't happen a few times in such a short period. People can die during surgery, but not usually as a result of total absolute negligence. To onlookers in the operating room, Dunch seemed about as skilled at surgery as you would be after watching a few YouTube videos on spine surgery. He was accused of being drunk on the job, but when his blood was tested for alcohol, he passed. Still, a friend later said that Dunch would party all night on booze and cocaine and then just waltz into work to perform possibly life-changing surgeries. She said, "I thought it was pretty amazing that he was even able to get to work the next day, like he wasn't scared. How did he not get arrested or at least fired then and there? That's the big question, and it's now one a lot of Americans are asking since they don't want their bodies ruined by a crazed surgeon." Dunch did have his surgical privileges revoked at that first hospital, and he was reviewed, but to prevent an expensive legal battle, the hospital allowed him to resign rather than risk getting sued by him for unfair dismissal. That's how it all went wrong, stage 1. He started working at Dallas Medical Center and was granted some privileges to perform surgeries. The hospital still wanted to hear from Baylor and so wouldn't yet grant Dunch full privileges. He didn't get those privileges because within 1 week of being there, he killed a woman named Floella Brown after cutting through her vertebral artery. The next day, he operated on Mary Eford and wanted to drill into her head even though he wasn't qualified to do so. He put screws in the wrong place, he severed her nerves, and he didn't remove the disc he was supposed to remove. In short, he went at her like a child in the game Operation, and there were lots of beeps. In this case, the beeps were his colleagues saying, "What the hell are you doing?" Some of them later said they thought he was high. When another surgeon, Robert Henderson, went in to try and correct the damage, he said it looked like Dunch had been playing with Tinker Toys. He called the operation an assault. In fact, he was so shocked at what he saw, he said this man has to be an imposter. No surgeon in the world, the entire world, could make a mess like that. Nonetheless, since Dunch was only there on a temporary basis, the hospital didn't have to report him. That could be a hassle, so Dunch just moved on. As you now realize, while he is the outright villain of this story, some blame can be put on the hospitals too. As Pontius Pilate did with Jesus, they washed their hands of him. Dunch managed to land more gigs at the Southampton Community Hospital in Dallas and at a clinic called the Legacy Surgery Center in Frisco, also in Texas. His ad hoc surgeries left one man without feeling in his right side and another man paralyzed from the neck down. Even with this huge tally of disaster to his name, he'd still walk around saying things like, "Everybody's doing it wrong. I'm the only clean, minimally invasive guy in the whole state." He operated on Jacqueline Troy, and as well as cutting through an artery, he severed her vocal cords. This kind of thing was unheard of in the history of modern surgery. Shortly after, with another patient, he thought a muscle was a tumor. He cut through the artery with this guy and again severed the vocal cords. Dr. Kirby, who we mentioned earlier, saw what happened. He couldn't believe his eyes. He called Dunch a maniac and said he was either trying to decapitate the patient or kill him some other way. He added that such reckless mistakes had never been seen in the history of U.S. medical care. And it's this man Kirby as well as Dr. Henderson that are the heroes of the story. They saw what was happening. Although as much as they warned people and complained to the hospitals, they couldn't get Dunch arrested or even have his license taken away from him. But then, at last, they finally managed to persuade the Texas Medical Board to suspend Dunch's license. Even then, Dunch was still trying to get his hands on more patients. He still believed he was the best out there, a delusion of grandeur likely a consequence of doing 8 balls of cocaine during the evenings. That was evident in the emails he sent, which sounded like he was trying to come across as some kind of medical rapper. In one email, he wrote that he was the supernova sophisticated savant, and on top of the alliteration, he said, "I do my thing, build my empire, party, and beep with models without knowing their names to make money." In yet another email, he was less lyrical, saying, "Anyone close to me thinks that I am likely something between God, Einstein, and the Antichrist." In another email, he was more honest, stating, "I am one of a kind, a mother-beeping stone-cold killer that can buy or own or steal or ruin or build whatever he wants." That would come back to bite him. The only thing he had in common with some rappers was his perpetual drug abuse, now with the added use of OxyContin and Xanax, and a history of violence, although no rapper could touch him on his violence record. But Kirby rapped back, writing in a report that his doctor was a clear and present danger to the citizens of Texas. He and Henderson by this time had even gone back to where Dunch had done his residency and showed him a picture of him to his former supervisors. Kirby and Henderson thought someone had to be pretending to be Dunch. No one could be that bad. But it was him. There was no imposter. The people that had trained him said they knew of nothing to Dunch's detriment. This didn't ring true for the two surgeons. Henderson later said, could he have permanent brain damage from either chemicals or from some organic reason, meaning a tumor? Or is this just a sociologic, pathologic personality that has flipped and become a destroyer instead of a healer? Still, the board only suspended his license, not completely revoked it. What is going on here, thought Henderson and Kirby. There was enough evidence to prove that Dunch wasn't just the worst surgeon the world had ever seen, but that he was likely an outright psychopath with a willingness to kill. Then a reporter in Dallas named Brett Shipp got hold of the story. He too couldn't believe what he'd found out. He also went after Dunch. The board subsequently asked a very well-respected surgeon to review Dunch's operations. He almost had an apoplectic fit reading about the bloody disasters. Just in one case alone, he said there was enough proof to be certain that Dr. Dunch didn't know what he was doing. He said it was an impossibility for a neurosurgeon not to know when someone was bleeding out, as had happened with Dunch one time. The board finally revoked Dunch's medical license, but it had taken way too long for Dr. Henderson and Dr. Kirby. There was a reason. Henderson was recorded talking to one of the board's investigators when he asked her how could Dunch still be practicing. She answered, "Sometimes we know that someone's bad, but when it comes to taking them to a hearing and proving it to where we can actually do some disciplinary action, it takes a time of gathering evidence. Unfortunately, sometimes it takes longer than we want. To write it did. There are people who'd still be walking if he'd been stopped earlier. We found other cases that involved malpractice by surgeons. They weren't anywhere near the levels of horrors committed by Dunch, but they too involved slow investigations. Kirby said with Dunch the action should have happened sooner. He was a special case, but maybe Dunch was so bad that no one could believe it. Kirby said in an interview, "This is a once-in-a-generation occurrence. We have someone off the rails this bad. This is why no one saw this coming." Also, let's remember that A-grade resume of Dunch's. Let's also recall that Dunch had an amazing marketing team. He appeared in TV commercials looking and sounding like a man you'd want to remove a disc from your back. Even if people looked at doctors' ratings on websites, he scored a 4.5 rating out of 5. A doctor like that is worth millions to hospitals that hired him, possibly $2.5 million a year. Nonetheless, at least 6 doctors complained to the board about Dunch. Some of them were almost hysterical when they told the board that this man must be stopped. In December 2013, he finally was, but that didn't mean Dunch was behind bars. Far from it. The lunatic was still on the loose. He was getting weirder, too. He moved to Denver, where in 2014 he was arrested for trying to get into the house of his ex-partner with whom he had a kid. Then he was arrested again for stealing stuff from Walmart worth $887.30. He shoplifted 5 pairs of sunglasses, a bunch of watches, some shoes, ties, some cologne, and a walkie-talkie. He was then broke. He had cracked, it seems, and was picked up one day by police wandering around and subsequently taken to a psychiatric hospital to be evaluated. He needed it. He was also picked up driving a car with 2 flat tires. That time he was charged with a DUI. One time again, when trying to get close to his ex, she found him in her apartment covered in blood. Dressed in his scrubs, he told her he had a tussle with some medical investigators, but that wasn't true. We don't know what happened to him. In July 2015, he was indicted for causing an injury to an elderly person, as well as 5 counts of assault. At the time of his arrest, he was staying at a hotel. Later in court, his lawyers argued that the fault lay with those who trained him, but that was a very weak defense. The prosecution pulled out some of his rapper-esque emails, showing the jury that stone-cold killer message. The jury was unanimous in saying that Dunch was guilty of intentionally or knowingly causing serious bodily injury to an elderly individual. Dunch made U.S. history, becoming the first surgeon to have been found guilty on criminal charges for his work. He was given that life sentence, but for some there was a bigger problem than Dunch. One neurosurgeon said the conditions which created Dr. Dunch still exist, thereby making it possible for another to come along. In total, he injured, sometimes severely, 33 out of 38 of his patients. 2 people died as a result of his insane actions. Some victims were compensated for what had happened, but this wasn't about money. One of them said it was more about getting him off the streets. "The public needs to know that there was a monster out there," the victim said. Unfortunately, as you watch this, some people are in a wheelchair or using crutches or are no longer in this world because a scalpel-wielding maniac was able to fool some people into thinking the devil didn't exist. Dunch will be eligible for parole in 2045, at which point he'll be 75. July 1979. Constable Andy Laptew turns up to the house of Peter Sutcliffe, a possible murder suspect. He's met at the door by Sutcliffe's wife and is invited in for a cup of tea and a chat. Sutcliffe appears in the living room, a man that doesn't look dissimilar from a Hollywood portrayal of the Antichrist. He has menacing eyes, almost like black dots, black hair, and a finely coiffed jet black beard. The police officer asks him, "Peter, do you frequent prostitutes?" The response is quick. "No, not at all. I've no need. I'm only recently married." After the interview, the cop leaves the house thinking this could be the guy. This could be the animal that's made women fear for their lives for years now in the towns and cities of West Yorkshire and beyond. Laptew goes back to the station and tells his boss that the guy he just spoke to is a dead ringer for the photo fit they have. That boss, one of many cops who would later be accused of doing dreadful police work, screams at the young constable, "Anybody mentions photo fits to me again will be doing traffic for the rest of their service." The higher-ups have a tape recording, one they're sure was made by the real Ripper. They're wrong, of course, and their shoddy work will mean flagons of blood spilled on the streets that needn't have been spilled. The case still today is arguably one of the most well-known serial killer cases the UK has ever had, bar London's Jack the Ripper, who it must be said wasn't anywhere near as prolific as the Yorkshire man. There's a saying in England that goes, "It's grim up north." If in the late 70s and early 80s you would have walked down certain streets in the industrial cities and towns of West Yorkshire, you wouldn't have disagreed. Those streets, with their dilapidated houses and rubbish piling up in the gardens, were the hunting grounds for the man that would become known as the Yorkshire Ripper. Like many kids back in those days, Sutcliffe was born into the kind of family where higher education was simply out of the question. For most working-class teenagers, they left school aged 15 or 16, and they either got a trade or worked in one of the industries in what was known as the Industrial North. One of Sutcliffe's first jobs was a gravedigger. a job perhaps quite apt for a man that would later ditch bodies. It's said that due to the morbid nature of his occupation as a teenager, Sutcliffe sometimes surprised people with his very dark sense of humor. Possibly something that happened during those days shaped what he would become. We'll get around to that later. All we'll say is that Sutcliffe apparently enjoyed washing the corpses, something that shocked his few friends when he told them about it in the pub. We don't know too much about his childhood, but it didn't sound very pleasant. One of 6 children, Sutcliffe was a mama's boy. As the saying goes, he was tied to her apron strings. His father never really gave much attention to who he considered the quiet, oddball son. This is what one of Sutcliffe's brothers later said about their father. He used to belt the hell out of us when we were kids. I remember when I was about 4 or 5, there was a bit of an argument and he smashed a beer glass into Peter's head. It's also said most of the children at times had to watch on helplessly as their father beat their mother. So this once quiet child with a history of violence undoubtedly didn't have the best of upbringings, but after a series of factory jobs and a stint unemployed, he landed himself work as a heavy goods vehicle operator at a place called T&WH Clark Holdings, and that's a name you're going to hear again. By this time, he'd already married Sonia Surma, a young woman he'd been dating for around 7 years. They tried to have children, but after a series of miscarriages, gave up. She also had an affair at one point, but still they stayed together and bought a house in Bradford with her savings from school teaching. The relationship doesn't exactly sound like one made in heaven, but nonetheless, a teacher and a driver living in a semi-detached property looked normal enough to family, friends, and neighbors. Together, the couple had nights out with people, they attended weddings. They were just another couple like any other. What his wife didn't know, though, is that her husband was a voyeur. Sometimes he'd go out at night and just watch women, especially women working in the atrociously run-down red light districts of Leeds and Bradford. In 1969, when Sutcliffe was 23 years old and had been with Surma for almost 2 years, he began his life of vicious crimes. This all happened after a prostitute had tricked him out of some money. Later the same night, after having a few drinks with a friend, they drove off in the friend's car. This friend is another matter of great importance that we'll come back to later. Sutcliffe told his buddy he wanted to get out of the car for a minute. He wanted to find the prostitute. He couldn't find her, but he saw another woman working the streets, so he followed her. In his hand was a sock filled with a stone. This is what he later admitted about that night. I got out of the car, went across the road, and hit her. The force of the impact tore the toe off the sock, and whatever was in it came out. I went back to the car and got in. His friend might not have seen it all take place, but that didn't matter. The cops had gotten the registration plate off of Sutcliffe's friend's car, so they ended up at Sutcliffe's home the next day. As you already know, this wouldn't be the first time they knocked on his door. In fact, prior to his arrest, they'd interview him 9 times. Yeah, this is one messed up case. What you'll discover is that it seems the police looked everywhere but the place they should have been looking. Anyway, when Sutcliffe talked to the cops, he had admitted he hit the woman, but he said he'd done so with his fist. The cops bought that story and also told Sutcliffe he was fortunate because the woman didn't want to press charges. Had she not been middle class, not a prostitute, you can be sure the police would have urged her to take things further. This was the late 60s, a time of widespread class prejudice and misogyny in England. July 1975. This time, the place of the crime is a textile town on the outskirts of the city of Bradford. Sutcliffe spots a woman walking down a quiet street at night. He walks behind her, says something to her, and subsequently strikes her hard on the head with a ball-peen hammer. He then slashes her stomach with a knife. Like many of his victims, she would survive, but the attack was so traumatic she later said she sometimes wished she died. A month later, he stalked a woman in the town of Halifax, a mill town not too far from Bradford. He asked her something about the weather before hitting her over the head with a hammer. Again, he slashed the victim, this time on the back. She also survived the attack. It should be said neither of these attacks happened in the red light areas, and the victims weren't prostitutes. The last woman had been out at the Royal Oak pub in Halifax and had stopped off on her way home to buy fish and chips for her and her husband. Sutcliffe had also been in that pub with the same guy he'd been with in the 1969 attack. At one point, Sutcliffe turned to his friend and said, "I bet she's on the game." The next day, that friend read the newspaper and saw a woman had been attacked after leaving Royal Oak. It did cross his mind that the perpetrator might have been Sutcliffe. Both times he could have killed the women, but he was interrupted during the commission of the crimes. Many years later, Sutcliffe told the police about the second attack. "I was going to kill her. I had the knife with me at the time. I was going to kill her, but I did not get the chance." Just after the crime, the woman told the police something of great importance. She said her attacker had a Yorkshire accent. This fact, and the fact that both women hadn't been attacked in red light areas, police chose to forget. This is very, very important for you guys to know. See, maybe you don't know that the accents in England can change even when you don't travel too far. You can travel from Bradford to Manchester or to Liverpool or to Newcastle in the northeast, and the change in accent is unmistakable. These places are all pretty close by, in USA terms anyway. You can drive as little as 20 miles from one city and people can sound different. So not long after that attack, Sutcliffe followed a 14-year-old girl down a quiet country lane. He approached her and they walked for a while and chatted. After about 20 minutes, he hit her 5 times over the head with a hammer. He then saw car lights and ran, leaving the girl for dead. She needed brain surgery, but when she came out, she could accurately describe her assailant and say what kind of accent he had. What we now have are 3 crimes that all look very similar, that happened not too far away from each other. Then, just a couple of months later, he attacked another woman with a hammer. This time, he stabbed the woman many times and she died. Even though these crimes were so similar, police hadn't linked them together. They had some details about the attacker given from surviving victims. They'd been told he was about 5'8". They knew he had a Yorkshire accent. They knew he had black hair and a black beard. Still, they believed one man was attacking prostitutes, and he wasn't the one attacking what they deemed good girls. In fact, the photo fit picture police put in the newspaper was his double. Little did police know that when that photo fit appeared in the newspaper, Sutcliffe joked with his mother-in-law about how much it looked like him. Just a few months later, he picked up a prostitute in Leeds. He drove her to some abandoned buildings where he hit her over the head with a hammer. This time, he used a sharpened screwdriver to stab her 52 times. He then dumped her body in what looked something like a junkyard, but it was just another downtrodden area. This time, he stamped on her, leaving an impression of his boots. That is also important. It was a size 7 Dunlop Warwick Wellington boot. This boot print would be seen again at a crime scene. Over the next year, he attacked more women in a similar style, usually using a hammer to knock them out and subdue them, and then stab them. Some of his victims would survive, but not without life-changing injuries. One woman he killed with a hammer and then mutilated her dead body. This time, he left tire tracks behind. That was another clue, since police could investigate what kind of car or at least what kind of tires they were looking for. Still, there were 100,000 possible matches for those tires. When he killed a 16-year-old girl, the police and the press all started talking about him now killing normal people, as if the other victims were inhuman or something. Such were the days, and the cops ashamed themselves at one point by calling the last girl the first innocent victim. They hadn't linked the 14-year-old who survived, which was a pity, since she had given an almost perfect description of him. The cops had been sure they had a prostitute killer, but they were wrong. At one point, they'd even invited prostitutes from West Yorkshire to attend a meeting so they could give them advice and ask them questions. One cop smiled just before the women entered the room and said to another cop, "I hope we're not going to catch anything sitting on these chairs." The other cop laughed and replied, "Well, I kept out of their way just in case." It was only after this murder that police really stepped up the investigation and the female public started thinking, "Oh, it could be me next." Time and again, the police said now a respectable woman had been killed. One of the biggest manhunts in English history was shaping up. Cops already had a lot of paperwork, so much the station had to reinforce the floor. On October 1st, 1977, Sutcliffe had chosen the city of Manchester as his next hunting ground. He made another mistake after paying a prostitute some money and killing her. He realized the £5 note he'd handed her could be traced. He returned to the part of Manchester where he dumped the body. This was described as a wasteland. When he couldn't find the note, Sutcliffe was enraged. He took a knife and mutilated the body as much as possible, almost taking her head off. The victim had worked on the mean streets, so she'd known to always hide money in a secret compartment in her purse. The police found it, of course. It was after this that the cops narrowed down their search to some 8,000 men. That note was issued by a bank for employee paychecks at certain companies. One of those companies was T&WH Clark Holdings. Sutcliffe was interviewed during his workday there, but the police didn't find anything suspicious about his story. As we described at the beginning, one cop ended up going to his house. There, his wife had said he'd been with her at a party on the night of the murder. She was lying. She had no idea he was a killer, but she was still giving false alibis for him. Then there was another survivor and yet another woman who described a man who was a dead ringer for Peter Sutcliffe. On top of that, the same tire tracks were found at the scene of the crime. Maybe if they hadn't had so much paperwork, they would have known he was a prime suspect. So much information in the days when technology was so backwards might have hampered the case. That, or the cops just sucked at their jobs. They even questioned him yet again about why his car was seen so many times in red light areas. It said the Ripper Squad had talked to him several times at this point. In '78, he killed again, twice, each time stabbing and slicing the corpses. He later told the cops about the '78 slaying. "I had the urge to kill any woman. The urge inside me to kill girls was now practically uncontrollable." In '79, he killed a 19-year-old girl as she walked home from her clerk job in the town of Halifax. The British tabloid press made it a much bigger news story when a young worker like this could be one of the Ripper's victims. The pressure now on the West Yorkshire police was intense. To say the least, they looked bad. That's one reason they sent the file to the FBI, an agency very experienced with serial killers. It's then that someone posted a tape recording packed into an envelope. It was addressed to the lead investigator. When they played it, they heard, "I'm Jack. I see you're having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you're no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started." Obviously, if you know anything about Jack the Ripper letters, you'll know this person was imitating those. Linguists listened to the recording and said this man was from Sunderland and Tyne and Wear in the northeast of England. That's almost 78 miles away from Bradford. And if you know your English accents, people from Sunderland sound nothing like the people from West Yorkshire. Cops had already heard how the attacker was short, had a Yorkshire accent, and how many people had described him as having black hair and a black beard. That didn't matter. They started investigating the man dubbed Wearside Jack. This would become one of the biggest embarrassments in UK policing history. Why? Because it was a hoax. Wearside Jack even sent letters to the Daily Mirror newspaper. One in part went like this: "I am the Ripper. I've been dubbed the maniac by the press, but not by you. You call me clever, and I am. You and your mates haven't a clue that the photo in the paper gave me fits." Experts even told the investigators that the letter and the recording were very likely the work of a hoaxer, but the cops stubbornly pressed forward with this line of investigation. The FBI's behavioral unit, the people tasked with catching serial killers in the US, told the Yorkshire cops that the tape was a hoax. They'd studied serial killers, they'd invented profiling, they were leagues ahead of sexist, misogynistic Yorkshire cops. One night, Robert Ressler sat down for some pints in a quiet pub with a Yorkshire investigator. This was the man depicted in the series of Mindhunter, and in real life, the guy that helped bring down the likes of Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy. He said to the cops, "You realize, of course, that the man on the tape is not the killer, don't you?" He then told them the man on the tape was an extrovert, when they should be looking for an introvert. They also said the guy they were looking for likely worked as a driver for a living. It was being able to move around for a job that gave him cover, he said, adding that the man was likely aged late 20s to early 30s and had some serious mental health problems. Even the surviving victims came forward and said it was not the man that had attacked them. The actual killer, Peter Sutcliffe, as you know, was even put at the back of the suspect list because he didn't have a Northeast accent. As the cops were looking for Wearside Jack, the real Yorkshire Ripper killed 3 more women and grievously injured 2 others. In 2005, thanks to DNA evidence that wasn't available back then, John Humble was arrested in the Ford estate in Sunderland. The man, now a poor alcoholic, admitted he'd been fascinated with Jack the Ripper, and that's one reason he pretended to be the Yorkshire Ripper. It was also revealed that out of guilt, Humble had called the police during the investigation and told them he was behind the hoax, but for some reason the cops didn't believe him. Humble was released from prison in 2009. He was given a new identity in view of how much the public despised him. His alcoholism killed him in 2019. But back to Mr. Sutcliffe. The game is almost up. The guy that'd been out with Mr. Sutcliffe the night he used a loaded sock to hit a woman over the head sent an anonymous letter to the cops marked priority number 1. It fell on deaf ears. This is what it said: "I have good reason to know the man you're looking for in the Ripper case. This man has dealings with prostitutes and always had a thing about them. His name and address is Peter Sutcliffe, 5 Garden Lane, Heaton, Bradford, Shipley." To think, the police had already visited this house and talked to the man 9 times. The former friend, having seemingly been ignored, even went to the police station and told the cops again he knew who the killer was. He told them he'd been with him when he attacked someone. After Sutcliffe's arrest, the record of this meeting just went missing. Sutcliffe was eventually arrested about a month later, but for a DUI. While waiting for his trial, he killed a middle-aged woman. He also attacked a student at Leeds University and a 16-year-old girl who felt so scared she slept with a knife under her pillow. At this point, cops had been warning women not to go out at night. This caused an outcry. Women marched in the streets saying why should they have to stay home at night. It was as if the cops were blaming them for going out. This was later called institutional sexism. Believe it or not, Sutcliffe even told his own sisters to stay home at night just to be on the safe side. At the same time, cops on the case were so stressed it led to ill health. The main guy in charge of the investigation, George Oldfield, had a heart attack in 1979. It's thought the stress of the case led to his early death at 61 in 1985. Another cop said this: "You know you'd go for a drink somewhere or to your local and they'd ridicule you." On January 2, 1981, Sutcliffe was stopped in his car by police in the city of Sheffield, around 31 miles from Bradford. The constable who stopped him soon found out there was a false license plate on the car. The man in front of him also looked exactly the same as the guy whose face had been printed in the newspaper from time to time. They took Sutcliffe to the small textile town of Dewsbury, where he was questioned about the Ripper case. The next day, cops returned to where they pulled him over. They also remembered he'd asked them if he could go for a pee since he was bursting. Lo and behold, where he'd taken that pee, or pretended to, police found a hammer, a knife, and some rope. At the station, police also found that Sutcliffe was wearing clothes that exposed his genitals. A V-neck sweater he wore inverted, so his legs went through the arms. They knew this had to be the killer. He denied it at first, but then with all the evidence being put in front of his face, he broke. He told the police, "The women I killed were filth. I was just cleaning up the place a bit." His actions, he claimed, were the orders of God. He said he'd first talked to God when he worked as a gravedigger. God came to him through a dead Polish man's grave, a Mr. Bronislaw Zapolski. This was heard during the court trial. While some of the victims were prostitutes, perhaps the saddest part of the case was that some were not. The last 6 attacks were on totally respectable women. You heard that right. The Yorkshire Ripper was sentenced to 30 years before he could meet with a parole board, although his sentence was later extended to life without the possibility of parole, a whole tariff as it's called in the UK. He was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and sent to Broadmoor High Security Psychiatric Hospital. During his years in prison and at the mental hospital, he was attacked a number of times. One time, a broken coffee jar was shoved into his face. Another time, he was almost strangled to death with some headphone cables. He was stabbed in both eyes with a pen in another attack, losing the sight in one eye and almost the sight in the other. He was stabbed in the neck during another attack. Sutcliffe died in prison on November 13, 2020. He'd been sick for some time with diabetes and he had a heart condition. A couple of weeks after a suspected heart attack, he was diagnosed with COVID-19, for which he asked not to be treated. According to the press, he was secretly buried, with the family being frozen out. This is what his brother had prepared as a eulogy. "Peter, all of your family love you as Peter Sutcliffe, although you ruined all our lives when you became the Yorkshire Ripper." In what seems absurd given the horror of the story, the family were allowed to attend the funeral via Zoom. June 12, 1971, 427 East 83rd Street, Manhattan, New York City. Detectives stood over the lifeless body of Cornelia Michael Crilly. The 23-year-old TWA flight attendant was found dead in her apartment, strangled by her own nylon stockings, bite marks on her chest. She wasn't just a victim, she was the first known target of a man who would become one of the most infamous killers in American history. He was a photographer and self-described artist who promised that if his subjects posed for him, he'd make them famous. That was true, but not in the way they were expecting. He was a serial killer of the sadistic variety, his crimes fueled by a dangerous mix of fake charm and razor-sharp intelligence. But it wasn't just his brutality that made him infamous, it was his brazen audacity. At the height of his killing spree, he stepped into the spotlight appearing on a primetime American dating show. He seemed to revel in hiding in plain sight, using his wits and sharp mind as a weapon. The same qualities that should have raised flags made him invisible. So how did they finally get him? That's what we'll reveal on this episode of the Infographics Show, how they finally caught the serial killer with the highest IQ. On September 13, 1978, millions of Americans settled down to watch the matchmaking TV show The Dating Game. Among the lineup of eligible bachelors was Rodney Alcala, introduced as a photographer who in his spare time enjoyed skydiving and motorcycling. His bio didn't include the fact that he liked killing women. It left out most of the chilling details. The part where he enjoyed toying with their minds, watching as fear consumed them. He'd sometimes strangle them to the point of death only to let them regain consciousness and relive their terror. He was, in short, a beast. Not the kind that hid in the shadows, but the kind that walked boldly among the public. A charming, attractive figure who wore his sheep's clothing well. Alcala flashed his best fake smile as the Bachelorette said, "I am serving you for dinner. What are you called and what do you look like?" With the charm of a practiced showman, he responded, "I'm called a banana and I look really good." A wave of laughter rippled through the unsuspecting audience. Reading from her pre-made script, she asked him to be a little more descriptive. Alcala's voice developed a playful tone, one laced with innuendo, as he said, "Peel me." The double entendre sent the Bachelorette into fits of laughter, cracked her up, and brought enthusiastic clapping from the audience. He ended up winning the game. As the audience cheered, Alcala's grin told a different story, one of hatred and danger, simmering just beneath the surface. The prize was free tennis lessons and a trip to the Magic Mountain theme park. But Rodney and her would never meet. She might have been on a game show asking inane questions, but she was perceptive. Behind the playful banter and laughter, something about him just didn't sit right. She called the producer to cancel the date, explaining that her bachelor was just too creepy. He gave off weird vibes and made her feel uncomfortable. It was a moment of intuition that might have saved her life. If the show had bothered to do a background check, they might have found out that he was a sex offender. Alcala evaded capture by slipping through the net, using fake names during his multi-state killing spree. But on the show, he'd chosen to be himself. By the time he smiled for the cameras, he had likely already killed dozens. His name had even been on the FBI's most wanted list. Yet, he decided to appear on a show that was watched by millions of people. His compulsion to torture people and photograph them likely took hold of him in 1968. It was a summer of love in the USA when the girls of California wore flowers in their hair and preached about love. Alcala looked like a perfect fit for the era, that year picking up a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree at UCLA. To anyone who met him, he was the kind of creative free spirit that was popular with the hippie girls of the 60s. He'd given himself a makeover, grown his hair long, and picked up a camera. This was a very different man from the one who had earlier had a nervous breakdown in the U.S. Army. He was discharged in 1964 after suffering from a nervous breakdown. There were also allegations of sexual misconduct. He was manipulative and mean, said the Army, a far cry from the guy who showed off his art degree 4 years later. His dark side was evident in 1968 when he lured 8-year-old Tali Shapiro back to his apartment in Hollywood. A passerby had seen her getting into Alcala's car on Sunset Boulevard and followed them to Alcala's place on DeLongpre Avenue. When the man saw them enter the apartment, his unease grew. He picked up the phone and called the police, unknowingly setting the stage for a pivotal moment in Alcala's dark history. By the time the two uniformed cops knocked on the door, Alcala had already subjected the young girl to unspeakable horrors. He had assaulted her, his cruelty escalating to a brutal attack with a metal pipe. Officer Chris Camacho demanded access to the apartment, but Alcala delayed, claiming he was in the shower. After a few moments, he briefly appeared at the door, his calm demeanor and composed expression masking the horror within. Alcala tried to stall even more. Camacho, rightly thinking this could be a matter of life or death, kicked in the door. As he did, Alcala fled, pushing past the officers and out through an exit. Camacho and his colleague now had a choice to try to save the girl's life or give chase, and they decided to stay. The image of what Camacho saw would stay with him forever. She had been beaten so badly he was sure she was dead. Alcala had not just beaten her with the pipe, he'd pushed it hard up against her neck. The police were sure she was dead. When they removed the pipe, they heard a groan. She was unconscious but alive. Shapiro was rushed to the hospital where she would remain in a coma for 32 days. Her survival was nothing short of miraculous, but her ordeal was far from over. When she finally regained consciousness, she recounted the terrifying moments leading up to her abduction. At first, she had refused to get in the car, but he insisted he knew her parents, warning her she'd get in trouble if she didn't go with him. Many years in the future, she'll meet him again, and things will be very different. This was a serious crime, so there was a major investigation. Leading it was LA Police Detective Steve Hodel, Hollywood Division, Juvenile Detail. He made sure Alcala was put on the FBI's most wanted list, and the cops interviewed the professors and students at UCLA. Most of them didn't believe it, saying no way was Alcala that kind of man. To them, he was a sophisticated and intelligent artistic man, a popular figure around campus. That was the thing about Alcala, he knew how to be popular. He could play the game, especially when he was hanging around people in the art scene. And where better to be an artist than in New York City? That's where he went next to enroll at NYU Film School under the alias John Berger. As he was planning his next attack in the East, the police back in California found among Alcala's clothes and equipment some photographs of mainly girls and young women posing for him. This was not a good sign. If he could get that many girls to model for him, it was almost certain he'd attacked people in the past, and he would do it again. Of course, there were plenty of pretty women at film school who'd jump at the chance to be snapped by a professional, especially one who was handsome and shared their artistic ambitions. He wasn't just any photographer. He had studied at the same prestigious school as Roman Polanski, an up-and-coming director whose name alone carried weight. The Upper East Side in Manhattan was the location of Alcala's first murder, at least the first murder on record. At the time, it was a fashionable and bustling neighborhood, popular with air stewardesses and secretaries. A perfect hunting ground for someone like him. Suffice it to say, there were plenty of women eager for the chance to be photographed by a guy who told them he would enter their pretty faces into competitions. This was how Cornelia Michael Crilly met him, who was found in her apartment with her stockings around her neck. As was customary with Alcala's victims, he posed the body. In the worlds of serial killers, posing or staging is what's known as a signature, something the killer does, sometimes unique, as if in a ritual. Posing was part of Alcala's depraved fantasies, an artistic expression of his utter domination. He also took trophies from his victims, another kind of signature. For a while, Crilly's boyfriend, Leon Borstein, was on the suspect list. He'd been living with Crilly, but only on a temporary basis. He'd helped her move her things into the new place, which she was sharing with another flight attendant. He got home from work that day to find the door locked. There was no answer when he knocked, and no one picked up the phone when he called, even though he was certain she was home. The cops soon arrived, only to be met with a scene of unspeakable horror. Before them lied the devastating evidence of a depraved mind at work. Not only had she been strangled, but there was a bite mark on her body and something had been stuffed into her mouth, clearly to silence the screams. It was a terrible crime, but given that year around 2,000 people were murdered in the Big Apple, the investigation was slow. Without today's forensic capabilities, the case went cold, and it would remain that way for 40 years. Unsurprisingly, Alcala moved again, changing his name but only slightly. He became John Berger with a U instead of an E. His destination was New Hampshire, where he secured the kind of job tailor-made for someone trying to mask their true nature behind a facade of respectability. At an arts and drama camp at Lake Sinape, he became a counselor for young girls, a chilling choice for a deviant maniac looking to exploit his access to vulnerable victims. During a rainstorm in the summer months at the camp, two girls ran into a post office in the village of George Mills when one of them noticed a wanted poster. The face staring back at them looked uncannily like their camp counselor, Mr. Berger. The name listed was Rodney Alcala, and he was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. They told the dean, and a few minutes later he was on the phone to Detective Hodel back in California. So, just after a few months as a counselor, Alcala was extradited back to California to face the music for the attack on young Tali Shapiro. He was looking at a hefty prison sentence, but the family had already moved to Mexico, and they refused to allow their traumatized little girl to testify. She'd already endured unimaginable pain, and her parents couldn't bear to subject her to the anguish of reliving the ordeal in court. Without the main witness, the prosecution offered Alcala a plea deal, and he got off with a 1-year to life sentence for molestation, and his name was on the sex offender registry. The light sentence stunned those like Officer Camacho who had seen what he had done to that poor girl. They were stunned a second time when they heard he became a free man again after just 34 months. This devious and violent charmer of women, a master manipulator, was not going to stop, and Camacho knew it. He was right. After just 2 months of freedom, Alcala was arrested again, this time for picking up a 13-year-old girl when she was on her way to school. He persuaded her to get in with him. Once he had her driven to a secluded location, his demeanor shifted, and he forced himself on her, attempting to kiss her as she struggled to resist. But unlike many of his victims, she lived to tell her story. Bravely, she reported him, leading to his arrest and a 2-year prison sentence. He was obviously a danger to society, but with that high intelligence of his, he managed to persuade the parole board that he was a reformed man. The parole officer even let him travel across the country. He went back to New York City, where police already had their hands full with a serial killer the media was calling the Son of Sam. Alcala was there just a week when he murdered 23-year-old Ellen Jane Hover, a wealthy socialite, musician, and artist, whose godparents were Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. Her dad had been a big shot in Hollywood, a nightclub owner and a friend to the stars. For that reason, when she went missing, it was front-page news. In her calendar, she had marked a meeting with a photographer who she called John Berger. Police interviewed her boyfriend, and he said he'd recently asked her who was the creepy guy that she'd been hanging out with. Alcala would soon appear on a popular TV show, despite the fact so many people knew his face and they could connect him to missing or murdered women. He was as brazen as they come. He had some of those traits of a typical psychopath: superficial charm, deceitfulness, risky behavior, and a grandiose sense of self-worth. Like so many serial killers in history, he probably thought he was smarter than everyone else. Hover's stepdad, Reuben Schwartz, a wealthy Garment District lawyer, put up a $100,000 reward, but the case went cold. Hover remained a missing person until her body was found in 1978, buried in a scenic spot overlooking the Hudson. It would later be discovered that an up-and-coming photographer had taken another young woman's photo there, though this girl was lucky enough to tell the story. Who knows how many young women eager for a chance to be photographed by a professional fell victim to Alcala in New York. What is certain is that the number of his victims is far greater than the charges he would one day face. He traveled extensively, moving from city to city, leaving a trail of fear and devastation in his wake. In Wyoming, he crossed paths with Christine, a good-looking, pregnant, free-spirited woman who was motorbiking across America. She vanished without a trace. He returned to LA in 1978, where he landed a job as a typesetter for the LA Times. Once he got to know his colleagues, he started showing them what he called his artwork. There were many hundreds of pictures he'd taken, mostly of young girls but also young boys. He was convincing, especially when he said prizes were involved. One of the many women he photographed later said that he was easy to trust. He had a way of talking to people that really put them at ease. This was around the same time he played the dating game but was rejected by the woman who made the mistake of choosing him. It's believed he couldn't handle rejection after his Mexican-American dad abandoned the family when he was still very young. Still, unlike so many other serial killers, it doesn't look like his childhood was especially traumatic. In the private schools he attended, he was a gifted student, a good athlete, the kind of guy who had nice things said about him in the yearbook. Still, he was definitely unusual. It was only 4 years after he enlisted at age 17 that he had a nervous breakdown and was called manipulative and psychologically unstable. Back in Los Angeles and just before Alcala's infamous game show appearance, police made a grim discovery. The body of an 18-year-old runaway, Jill Barcombe, was found, a brutalized victim whose murder bore the hallmarks of a depraved mind. Investigators believed her death was the work of a serial killer known as the Hillside Strangler, who, like Alcala, abducted, tortured, and killed girls and young women. Standing at 5 feet and weighing just 100 pounds, Barcombe was picked up on Sunset Boulevard. Her body was found close to the actor Marlon Brando's house on Mulholland Drive. She was naked and in a kneeling position, so almost certainly had been deliberately posed. Her skull had been crushed by a rock that was found nearby, and she had been strangled multiple times with a belt, pantyhose, and with one of her pant legs. As for the triple asphyxiation, whoever did this wanted to see the victim suffer prolonged agony. Just a month later, Alcala forced his way into the Malibu apartment of a 27-year-old nurse named Georgia Marie Wickstead. Her body was found posed in the bedroom. She had been hit on the head, mutilated, and strangled with stockings. Bodies were being found all over LA. Since Alcala was on the sex offenders list, he was looked at by the Hillside Strangler Task Force. They interviewed him at his mother's house, but at this point he was not high on the list of suspects. They actually arrested him for marijuana possession, and he spent a little while in jail, but he was soon out again, telling strangers he wanted to shoot them for his portfolio. His next victim was Charlotte Lamb, a 32-year-old legal secretary who was found strangled by shoelaces in the laundry room of her apartment complex in El Segundo. Again, the body had been posed. She had also had her earrings stolen, something Alcala would one day regret. Then in February 1979, he picked up a 15-year-old hitchhiker in Riverside County. The girl, Monique Hoyt, first went to his apartment and later he drove her out to Joshua Tree, where he bound and beat her. He photographed her, but he didn't kill her, taking her back to the city where she called the police from a motel. Alcala was jailed, but his mom posted bail and he was soon back out looking for more victims. In June 1979, he murdered 21-year-old Jill Parenteau, a computer key punch operator who'd skipped out of work early to attend a baseball game. The next day, she failed to show up for work. She was found in her apartment posed and naked in the bathroom, beaten and strangled. This time, the killer left a clue. He had cut himself climbing through a window and left spots of blood. Forensic DNA technology was not yet invented, but the presence of blood at a crime scene was still very useful to police as a way to whittle down a list of suspects. What was also useful is one of Parenteau's friends said that she had been hanging out with a guy at the club. And yes, if she saw his face, she would remember him. Alcala's reign of terror was coming to an end. He was getting desperate and sloppy. His world was closing in on him. On June 20th, 1979, Robin Samso, a 12-year-old from Huntington Beach, borrowed her friend's bicycle so she could get to ballet class. She didn't make it. Her body was later found rotting away in the foothills of the Sierra Madres. But the day she went missing, a neighbor, Jackie Young, had seen Samso and a friend, Bridget Wilvert, playing near the beach. She saw a man trying to take photos of them as they frolicked in their swimsuits. The woman would chase the man away, but Young and Wilvert would remember the man's face. In fact, quite a few people saw him around the beach that day trying to convince young girls to pose for him. It was only because a neighbor intervened that he left, apparently looking very upset. Samso needed to get to ballet class and Wilvert said, "Take my bike," and that was the last time Wilvert saw her friend alive. 12 days after Samso went missing, William Popke, a U.S. Parks Ranger, found her decomposing body, as well as a kitchen knife and a pair of shoes lying close by. Dane Krappa, another park ranger, said that she'd seen a guy taking a girl down to the same wooded area. She'd also seen the car he drove, a Datsun F10, the same type of car Alcala drove. Police now had a composite sketch from Wilvert's description. Alcala's parole officer saw it and he was pretty sure that was his guy. After all, there weren't too many sex offenders with long curly hair around who had just been arrested for picking up children. On July 24, 1979, police arrested Alcala at his mother's place in Monterey Park and charged him with the murder of Samso. It was a major breakthrough in their investigation, but what they uncovered next would reveal the staggering scope of his crimes. At the house, they found a receipt for a storage locker in Seattle. When they went to open it, they were met with a chilling discovery. They found a trove of photos of girls, boys, and women. Among the items that they found were 2 pairs of earrings, one of which would later be identified as a trophy from the murder of Charlotte Lamb. There was no way he was going to get himself out of this. But what police didn't know right then was the full extent of his crimes. In 1980, he was found guilty of Samso's murder and sentenced to death. He might have died then and there, as Marianne Connolly, Samso's mother, had sneaked a .25 caliber pistol into the trial. She intended to use it if justice wasn't served. Connolly later admitted that her desire for revenge was fueled by the fear that the system would fail her daughter. She felt like doing that again when, just a year after his sentencing, she opened a newspaper to see that the California State Supreme Court ruled that Alcala had not received a fair trial. The jury had heard about his previous crimes, which according to the article had prejudiced their decision. It would take decades to prove many of the other murders were his, including the New York cases of Ellen Hover and Cornelia Crilly. He'd been a major suspect in many others. When in 2010, the police made public 120 photographs he'd taken over the years, 21 women identified themselves, and at least 6 families identified someone who had disappeared in the past. Many of the people in those shots remain unidentified to this day. Moreover, police held 900 photos back because they didn't think the public needed to see sexually explicit poses, and there's a very good chance they included many more of his victims. At his 2010 trial, he was convicted of murdering Barcombe, Wickstead, Lamb, and Parenteau. Choosing to represent himself, he addressed himself in a deeper voice as Mr. Alcala. If that wasn't strange enough, in his closing argument, he told the jury that if they gave him the death penalty, they too would be murderers. In 2016, he was charged with another murder, and the woman had indeed appeared in those photographs. She was 28-year-old Christine Ruth Thornton, the pregnant motorbiker in Wyoming. The location proved Alcala had spread his wings far and wide. Described as a free spirit, she'd been traveling to Montana in 1977 to pan for gold after splitting with her boyfriend. She was 3 months pregnant at the time that she vanished. Her mom spent the next 39 years looking for her, and then in 2013, her son sent her an email with pictures attached. One of them was a good-looking woman on a motorbike, one of many photos from Alcala's vast collection. It was her daughter, all those years ago before she went missing. The mother submitted her DNA to a database of missing persons. That blood was eventually matched with the bones of a person found buried just yards from where that photo of Christine was taken. Alcala had more than likely killed her just moments after he took that shot, and he told her he would make her famous. He was an old man when that discovery was made. Still, a detective went to see him at the medical unit of Coracan Prison near Fresno, where he was being treated for dementia. The detective showed him photos of that location, to which he said in surprise, "I know that area. That's my area." He was then handed the photo of Christine on a bike. Alcala would spend the next 5 minutes tracing his index finger over the photograph. He kept on tapping it, playing mind games with the detective. He wouldn't admit to killing Christine, but he admitted he had been there with her. It was enough to charge him with first-degree murder, but he never stood trial for it. He died in the prison hospital of a heart attack in 2021, age 77. The full extent of his crimes may never be known, and the scars he left on countless families will never fully heal. What do you think about Rodney Alcala's horrifying double life? How did he fool so many, even on live TV? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We would love to hear your take. November 1975. Detectives wince at the sight before them. Mud-caked limbs, each in various stages of decomposition, have been excavated from shallow graves deep in the woods of Prospect, Florence County, South Carolina. The stench of death hangs in the air. Next to the detectives, a man stands handcuffed, a look of shame and fear etched into his face. 30-year-old Walter L. Neely is a man of ill temperament and exceptionally low intelligence and has just turned informant. He's led the detectives to what his manic friend called his own private cemetery. This friend, this nightmare in human form, is 42-year-old Donald Pee Wee Gaskins. A grandfather, a killer, a mutilator, a cannibal. Soon the world will know him as the meanest man in America and the redneck Charles Manson. But at this moment, detectives have only scratched the surface of his unparalleled depravity. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we'll look at the horrifying case of Donald Pee Wee Gaskins and how they caught the meanest serial killer in American history. From a young age, Pee Wee Gaskins felt something dark churning up inside him. He described it as a ball of molten lead rolling around in my guts and up my spine into my head. A migraine of fire that would erupt in his head, and it could only be extinguished by inflicting obscene violence on innocent people. But Pee Wee didn't just kill to quiet the agony, he killed for fun. And he killed for more pressing reasons. His serious murders, torture, mutilation, execution. The acts themselves fueled him, possibly claiming the lives of 100 people, a body count that would put him among the worst serial killers in American history. To understand the depths of Pee Wee Gaskins' madness, we need to go back to what the semi-illiterate, superlative-loving Pee Wee called my busiest year and my killingest year. In the fall of 1974, the year Pee Wee called chillingly the happiest and peacefulest I can remember, his fifth wife walked out. She was another woman who made the fatal mistake of marrying a man whose extracurricular activities involved inflicting his darkest fantasies on young girls. That year ended with a proposition. Just before the breakup, someone made the mistake of trying to broker a deal with Pee Wee. That man wanted Pee Wee's wife, for a price of course, just one night, an indecent proposal out in the boondocks where life appeared to be cheap. Pee Wee didn't get offended by the offer. It didn't bother him, but he just didn't like the tone of the guy's voice. He later wrote, "I would probably have given her to him for a night or a week or to keep if the offer was good enough. But this man Horace Jones was pushy, so Pee Wee shot him 3 times in the head. After emptying his wallet of $200, Pee Wee buried Jones in the woods outside of Prospect. The proposal and the murder may appear shocking, but in the life of Pee Wee Gaskins, it was nothing out of the ordinary. In February 1975, Pee Wee was hired for a contract murder. He had something of a reputation around Prospect as a man who would do anything for the right price. The contract was to take out an elderly man named Silas Barnwell Yates. His mistress, 27-year-old Suzanne Kipper, had had enough of him. Yates was a wealthy Florence County farmer who'd showered Kipper with gifts. But he'd recently repossessed a car and 2 horses that he bought her. It was over. But not for Kipper. She felt that she was owed something. Yates also made the mistake of also showering her with cash. So, when the time came to kill him, she had $1,500, $8,700 in 2025, to pay for the murder. A contract was arranged between Pee Wee and 2 men named John Powell and John Oates. Pee Wee needed help for the hit, so he enlisted the ex-wife of his good friend. That friend was Walter Neely, and his former wife was Diane Neely. Meeting Pee Wee was the worst thing that ever happened to both of them. February 12th, the trap was set. Just as Pee Wee planned, Diane pretended her car had broken down right outside of Yates' house. In the dead of night, Yates, a concerned citizen, went outside to see if he could help. Pee Wee burst from the shadows with a gun in his hand and pointed it at Yates' head. Before he could react, Pee Wee shoved Yates into the car. They sped off into the darkness toward the woods. Pee Wee stabbed Yates to death and sliced his throat, burying him in the earth below where he fell. Of course, Pee Wee being Pee Wee, this wasn't over. He was almost pathological about tying up loose ends, and he always exploited his position when he saw a weakness in others. Suzanne Kipper eventually married one of the go-between guys, and for a while, she might have been content. But Pee Wee saw an opening, and when he saw an opening, he took it. He turned the murder into a blackmail scheme, forcing Suzanne into a twisted arrangement where he could have his way with her whenever he pleased. But in Pee Wee's world, friendship and loyalty didn't exist. Diane Neely decided to blackmail Pee Wee. She had teamed up with Avery Howard, a 35-year-old ex-con who knew Pee Wee from prison. Howard demanded $5,000 from Pee Wee or they would turn him in for murder. But they weren't just threatening to expose a killing. They were ready to spill his darkest secret, his sick obsession with young girls. Pee Wee told Howard and Diane he'd meet them in the woods outside Prospect where he had stashed some cash. When they arrived, Pee Wee had been kind enough to spare them the effort of digging their own graves. He shot them both and proceeded to pile soil on them in the ditches he dug. This wouldn't be the last people to underestimate Pee Wee, and they certainly weren't the first. Pee Wee waited until September for his next murder. In terms of work-life balance, he'd been doing great. He'd always been a very capable mechanic. For decades, he made money from stealing cars and refitting them himself. Business was good. But as usual, someone disturbed his tranquility. That someone was 13-year-old Kim Gelkins. She was threatening to tell the police that Pee-wee and some of his friends had been taking advantage of her in the back of Pee-wee's trailer. Pee-wee embraced a zero-tolerance outlook in life, so he took Gelkins out to the woods and after strangling her, made her another member of his steadily growing cemetery. This being his killingest year, he still had a lot of ground to cover. At the start of the year, Pee-wee had added to his toll of what he called his coastal murders. These were his fun murders, as opposed to his serious murders. The former were just murders for relieving his headaches and his sexual gratification. The latter murders were just business, tying up loose ends that bothered him too much. When seeking fun, Pee-wee would drive up and down the coast looking for hitchhikers to pick up. He'd usually take them out to the swamp and give them an offer they couldn't refuse. He'd then brutally torture them and dump their bodies into the ground or the swamp. So that was Pee-wee's plan at the start of 1975, when he saw a van broken down on the highway. The two young women and the young man greeted Pee-wee with big smiles, unaware that they had just signed up for an early grave. Pee-wee later called them hippie types from Oregon who were doing a Jack Kerouac-style tour of the USA. He told them that he'd take them to the nearest garage, and so they just jumped in his car and thanked him for his kindness. There were 3 of them, and he was just a tiny fellow with a squeaky voice. What was the worst that could happen? At some point, Pee-wee turned off the highway and headed down the dusty track. Growing concerned, one of the group questioned the route that Pee-wee was taking. That was when Pee-wee brandished his firearm. Pee-wee Gaskins was not a man of his word. He mutilated the man for fun and killed him, and after he was done with the girls, he tortured and drowned both of them. Pee-wee later said, "It was hard to say which one suffered most. I tried to make it equal." But Pee-wee soon discovered that he had a problem on his hands. He now had a broken-down van on the highway to get rid of. And that's when he enlisted the help of Walter Neely, who took the keys and drove the van back to the garage where Pee-wee customized his stolen vehicles. Intellectually compromised, Neely may not have realized that he was now an accessory to a triple murder. Instead of running a mile, he moved into Pee-wee's trailer, and as they say, the rest is history. Pee-wee hadn't exactly gone under the radar of the police. However, they just thought that Pee-wee was a small-time crook with a history of violence. There were plenty of these types around Prospect. But now it was becoming clear to some detectives that a lot of people had been vanishing, and some of them could be connected to Pee-wee. But a few more people would have to die before the cops started to join the dots and could see Pee-wee Gaskins for what he was, a pint-sized monster. In October, Diane Neely's brother, 25-year-old Dennis Bellamy, and his 15-year-old half-brother, Johnny Knight, made a fatal mistake. They thought that they could clean out Pee-wee's chop shop and get away with it. But like so many before them, they underestimated the monster they were dealing with. What happened next is up for debate, but every version of the story ends with the pair being slaughtered and buried in Pee-wee's cemetery. Some say they robbed Pee-wee and paid with a head full of bullets. Others claim they got drunk with him, started trouble, and Pee-wee put Bellamy down before silencing Knight, the unlucky witness. Another version is that Pee-wee promised Bellamy cash for stolen guns, then decided keeping the money was better for his financial health. Whatever the truth, he murdered and buried them both, and Walter Neely was a witness. It could have been during his burial that Pee-wee proudly pointed out to Neely all the others lying in his cemetery. So even more people had gone missing. It was only after Kim Gelkin's mom and pop went to the cop that the police started focusing on Pee-wee. The parents told the police before their daughter went missing she was shacked up with Pee-wee, so the cops looked into his background. As you can imagine, Pee-wee wasn't what you would call a silver spoon child. His mother, Molly, the daughter of tobacco planters and cotton pickers, dropped out of school at the age of 12. She had Pee-wee on March 13, 1933, in the poorest of poor Great Depression-era areas in Florence County, South Carolina. Pee-wee's father, or so the story goes, was a wealthy and habitually drunk landowner who paid Molly $1 each week. However, when he discovered she was pregnant, he started giving her $10 a week for her very own shack, which didn't have many modern conveniences. As for his early life, Pee-wee was bullied and humiliated by Molly and the countless men that she brought back to her house. He suffered extreme neglect as Molly and the drunk men would frolic in front of him, hitting him if he got in the way. Pee-wee later said all of these stepdaddies beat him just for practice. It wasn't as if he could fight back. He was so small that by the time he could talk, he was already known as Pee-wee. He likely grew to 5'4", although some reports say he was just 5'2", and 130 pounds as a fully grown adult. In later life, he'd said his upbringing was just standard for those days. The only thing that made him feel safe was when he would hide out in the woods. So that was young Pee-wee, born into domestic hell, brought up on large doses of poverty and trauma served up with a rusty spoon. Hardly surprising then that he dropped out of school at age 11 and was soon a part of a burglary gang. He and his two little gangster friends, Danny Smith and Henry Marsh, were nicknamed the Trouble Trio, but Pee-wee was the worst. He was depraved. When he was barely into puberty, he was spending the proceeds of his crimes on prostitutes in Charleston and Columbia, driving there in stolen cars. With his hormones raging and his impulse control non-existent, he and his gang assaulted girls in the area, including Henry's younger sister. Pee-wee was good as well as bad with his hands, and by the time he was 15, he was already a fairly skilled mechanic. But crime thrilled him. Stealing and sex was never far from his mind. That year, after countless beatings for myriad childhood transgressions, he was introduced to serious punishment. While burglarizing a house, a 16-year-old girl awoke and ran at him with a hatchet. Pee-wee got the better of her, grabbed the hatchet, and knocked her unconscious with it. It was only at the subsequent trial that he was charged with assault with a deadly weapon and intent to kill that he learned what his real name was. Not Pee-wee, but Donald Henry Gaskins. Then he moved to a reform school, the South Carolina Industrial School for Boys, where, as one of the smallest kids, he quickly learned about extreme violence. After about a year of unrelenting physical and mental abuse, Pee-wee and some other kids escaped, only for Pee-wee to be found hiding out in the woods he so loved, and then given lashes for the next 30 days. The headmaster wrote, "We consider him dangerous, and also, he has the homicidal tendencies peculiar to a paranoid type." Pee-wee got hard labor and 3 months of solitary confinement, but he later said he enjoyed being alone because it spared him from the beatings by the other kids. Suffice it to say, life didn't get much better in that home. Pee-wee received many beatings from the adult carers, which once led him to suffering a ruptured appendix. Pee-wee got out, age 18, and married a girl named Mary. For a while, he worked in the swamps logging cypress trees and later joined a reform school buddy, Slick, working on tobacco farms. With Mary pregnant, Pee-wee and Slick started burning farms in an insurance scam. A young girl later threatened to snitch on Pee-wee, and so he smashed her skull in with a hammer, incurring a charge of assault with a deadly weapon and 6 years in South Carolina State Penitentiary. Some people sometimes say that predators have a kind of radar and they can spot victims a mile away. Well, no sooner than Pee-wee went to prison, he became the sweetheart of a rather uncompromising and unethical adult. Everyone laughed at him and called him a punk. One day, Pee-wee had had enough. He walked up to the toughest guy on the block, Hazel Brazel, and then slit his throat with a homemade knife, killing him almost instantly. Pee-wee later wrote, "I didn't really feel nothing much at all." He got lucky too, being able to claim self-defense and getting just 6 months in solitary. His sweetheart days were over. No one messed with Pee-wee after that. He learned that violence was king. It didn't matter how small you were. If you were willing to go that extra yard, people feared you. He also now had a taste for murder, which it turned out had made him feel great. For a while, Pee-wee drifted with the carnival, crisscrossing the country in a twisted American odyssey. Somewhere along the road, he married again, and crooked characters including Zena from Zanzibar, real name Betty, who after taking advantage of Pee-wee got him sent back to prison. This time, Pee-wee made his mark as soon as he entered, attacking a prisoner and slicing off his ear. He spent the next few years being moved around, becoming known as a useful assassin who would hurt someone real bad for the right money. Frank Costello, who was the godfather of the Genovese crime family in New York, gave Pee-wee the nickname the Little Hatchet Man in a prison in Atlanta. Over the years, Pee-wee cycled through marriages, prison sentences, and an endless spree of violence, theft, and an ever-growing obsession with young girls. People trusted him. He had a way of seeming friendly and harmless, but behind the grin lurked something far darker. As one prosecutor later put it, a real odd bird. He was either real nice or he killed you. It was after a stint in prison in Columbia that he realized that if he didn't want to go back to prison, he had to make sure his victims were kept quiet, eternally. 1969, Sumter, South Carolina. Pee-wee was now 36. The headaches, the bothersomeness were getting worse. He was working construction on the weekdays and stealing and stripping cars in his free time. But what he really wanted, what drove his every thought, was to kill women. One day he saw a young blonde woman hitchhiking near Myrtle Beach. He hadn't been hurting that day, but he later said that he was real fond of her because she had been so nice to me. When they were finally alone in a secluded area, Pee-wee swung a hammer into her skull, the beginning of 4 days of unimaginable torture. When he was done, he discarded her like garbage, dumping her body in a swamp. In September, he picked up another blonde girl, this time on Pawleys Island. Her name was Angie. After committing acts of sexual depravity, he mutilated her body, before drowning her and throwing her belongings in the river. He called these fun murders a miracle, like a beam of light shining down, showing him the path forward. He had to kill again. It was the cure for his headaches. The voices in his head told him so. That's when he started calling these recreational medicinal kills his coastal murders. It's not certain when he killed his niece Janice and her friend Patty in 1970 if this qualified as serious or recreational. They were just young women who had been drinking, so Pee-wee kindly volunteered to take them back to his place to help them sober up with strong black coffee. As was his way, he tried it on with Patty. With vomit down her shirt, she rejected him as his niece lay unconscious on the sofa. Janice awoke to Patty's screams and the two girls attacked him. They hit him on the head with a lamp and ran for their lives, only for Pee-wee to catch up to them in his car on the path close to the woods. He bundled them into the trunk and took them back home, where he knocked them unconscious. He buried Janice near an old barn in Prospect and hid the body of Patty in a septic tank in Sumter. Pee-wee may have been responsible for the murder of 13-year-old Margaret Peggy Coutinho, daughter of State Senator James Coutinho. She was found in Sumter County's Manchester Forest, her body covered in cigarette burns, strangled to death. Another man was convicted, but Pee-wee insisted it was his doing. He claimed he killed her because she called him white trash. In 1972, he killed his first black woman, a 20-year-old named Martha Ann Dix who preferred the male name of Clyde. Martha was a drug addict with a long list of petty crimes on her rap sheet. On March 29th, having known Pee-wee for quite some time, she was pregnant and told Pee-wee she was going to call the baby Pee-wee Dix. It was a joke, but Pee-wee didn't find it funny. Dix usually dated other women, but she had a thing for Pee-wee. She used to tell people she was dating him and that the kid was his. One evening, he attacked her, forcing her to eat a whole jar of medicine and dumped her lifeless body in a ditch. He later said, "I didn't kill her for no reason besides her lying mouth." Pee-wee wasn't done with his serious murders. He might have killed 24-year-old gun runner Eddie Brown and his wife Bertie, partners in crime who made the mistake of trusting him. When Pee-wee suspected the police were closing in, he didn't take any chances. He took their lives. Then in 1973, he picked up a 14-year-old girl and subjected her to his routine of torture. Pee-wee later said, "It was not really a serious murder, but likewise, not just another coastal kill." He then killed Doreen Hope Dempsey, 22, and her 2-year-old daughter Robin. She and Pee-wee were old buddies from his carnival days. He had a hearse at the time with a sign in the window that said, "We haul anything, living or dead." It was a working business, but he later said, "I kill so many people I need a hearse to haul them to my private cemetery." It was this vehicle he told Doreen he'd use to take her and her daughter to the bus station. Instead, he killed them both and buried them in his cemetery. Pee-wee's daughter later said he killed the kid because he knew he wouldn't be able to resist his depraved temptations had he let her live. He later killed 36-year-old car thief Johnny Sellers. Sellers owed Pee-wee $1,000 for auto parts or a stolen boat, but he took his time paying the debt, so as usual, Pee-wee lured him out to the woods and shot him. He later said, "Me and Johnny walked around there in the woods, and I pretended I'd seen a snake, and I asked Johnny did he have his gun with him, so Johnny says I ain't got no bullets for my gun. I went back to my car and I got my gun and I shot Johnny." Johnny's 22-year-old lover, Jessie Ruth Judy, knew that he was meeting with Pee-wee, so Pee-wee paid her a visit. He stabbed her to death and buried her next to Johnny. Goes without saying that for his fun murders, Pee-wee preferred women and girls, but he wasn't what you would call a formalist kind of killer. In 1974, he followed 2 girls in his car, and when they finally stopped, he got out to greet them, only to realize they were 2 young guys with long hair, quite typical in the 70s. He took the boys at gunpoint to a quiet area where he tortured both of them, later claiming to have cut off pieces of their flesh to cook and eat. Death, Pee-wee said, was giving them mercy, according to what he wrote in his book. As 1974 came to an end, just as his 5th wife divorced him, Pee-wee carried on as if nothing had happened. All of this violence, all of his murders happened while he was living with his wives and children, playing the role of husband and father. And in a chilling display of his depravity, right after killing his own niece, he invited family over for dinner. It was actually Pee-wee who left his last wife, not the other way around. He later explained, "I got so edgy and mad at the world I just had to get away." He added, "I truly loved them all." The mother and father of Kim Gelkins would certainly have not believed Pee-wee was even remotely capable of loving someone. They told the cops about their daughter going off with Pee-wee, and soon detectives had a warrant to search his trailer. After years of evading suspicion, the cops were now finding the clothes of a young girl, and they knew they were onto something. The parents confirmed they belonged to Kim. He was charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor, and it was suspected he might have killed this girl. But if Kim was dead, where was her body? The cops were closing in on Walter Neely, locked in a jail cell. Pee-wee's former roommate, his reluctant accomplice, was an easy target. Neely lacked cunning. He was weak, impressionable. So when a minister urged him to do the right thing, it didn't take much. Within hours, he was leading detectives straight to Pee-wee's private cemetery. One of those detectives later said when they started digging, putrefied human skin emerged from the mud like something out of a horror movie. Pee-wee denied all wrongdoing, but he knew in his heart it was over. He later wrote, "The coroner had the bodies, Jesus had Walter, and the law had me." Both Pee-wee and Walter were up for 8 counts of murder, but these were just some of his murders. As time went on, it would be confirmed he killed 15 people, but there were certainly a lot more than that. As for Walter, his defense rightly argued he wasn't a killer. His lawyer said he was an idiot who had been manipulated, to which Pee-wee later said, "I reckon that was true too. Walter surely weren't real bright, and he did pretty much anything I asked him." Pee-wee was handed the death penalty on May 24, 1976, but it was later commuted to life in prison. This is where he managed to commit perhaps his most mind-boggling murder. One of the men on death row was Rudolph Tyner, who'd received a death sentence for a botched armed robbery that left an elderly couple dead in their small South Carolina store. The son of the couple, Tony Simo, was enraged. He then learned that his parents' killer was locked up with a man who would do anything for the right price. Simo was told that Pee-wee was a maintenance man, and he often had access to death row. In a phone call, which Pee-wee recorded with a small tape deck for later blackmail purposes, he agreed to murder Tyner. He said it'd be easy. Tyner was a prison junkie, so he'd just make friends with him and give him a gift of free heroin laced with what he said was poison, quote, strong enough to kill a horse. Except, it just gave Tyner stomach problems. He also laced candies with poison, and still Tyner didn't realize that it was the gifts from Pee-wee making him sick. Pee-wee, always good with his hands, decided to make a bomb from hardware and C4 plastic explosives that Simo had smuggled into prison in the hollowed-out heels of some cowboy boots. On September 12, 1982, Tyner pressed a crude walkie-talkie, 2 cups connected by wire, against his ear. Pee-wee had rigged them up so they could chat in secret. But Tyner had no idea that the cup in his hand wasn't just for talking. It was connected to a detonator. Pee-wee told him to hold it steadily, listen closely, then he pressed the trigger. A second later, fragments of Tyner's brains were splattered against his cell walls. His head had quite literally been blown off. Pee-wee later bragged the last thing he heard through that speaker cup before it blew his head off was me laughing. After prison snitches revealed what really happened, Simo was charged with murder, but made a plea and only got 8 years. Pee-wee's sentence was death, and this time it would stick. It was actually the first time in the history of South Carolina a white man was sentenced to death for killing a black man. On death row, Pee-wee started dictating his book, once saying, "I truly don't mind dying. I've lived a damn full and good life." He had the gall to say that he had walked the same path as God, explaining, "By taking lives and making others afraid, I became God's equal. Through killing others, I became my own master. Through my own power, I come to my own redemption." He thought he could get away with his date with old Sparky by hurting himself in his cell, but his plan failed. At 1:05 a.m. on September 6, 1991, after the last words of, "I'll let my lawyers talk for me, I'm ready to go," the lever was pulled. Detectives stand over the lifeless body of Ida Brigitte Tesha Kane, a 44-year-old German-American found at the foot of Mount Tamalpais. In the distance, the iconic Golden Gate Bridge rises amongst the mist and clouds. Her death wasn't just a murder, it was an execution, a cold, calculated shot to the back of the head. The man responsible reveled in the terror of his victims, savoring the moments when they begged for their lives. The case left a permanent scar on law enforcement and the FBI, shaping the way serial killers are hunted today. In today's episode of the Infographics Show, how the Trailside killer changed the way the FBI hunts serial killers. The day before Ada's body was found, she told her husband she planned to go for a Sunday hike in the hills. It was an escape for her, a way to clear her mind before starting another busy week at the bank in downtown San Francisco. Ada often enjoyed these hikes with her husband or close friends, but that day she decided to go alone. Her husband didn't think much of it. After all, the trails were well marked and popular. Hiking in the secluded hills around Mount Tamalpais wasn't usually dangerous. Until now. She didn't return home that night. Concerned, her husband called the police, fearing she might have gotten lost or injured on the trails. Her car was still in the car park. so it seemed obvious that she was still out there, somewhere. Through the night, a search party combed the dark forested hills, their hounds in tow. But it wasn't until the next day, when the search had been resumed, that they stumbled upon what the media would later call a grisly discovery. When they found Ida, she was lying face down in the mud, her body motionless in the damp earth. A single bullet hole pierced the back of her skull, a precise, deliberate act of violence. There were no signs of a struggle and no indication of a clear sexual motive. Whoever had done this had rifled through her wallet, stealing her credit cards and $10 in cash. Strangely, they had taken her glasses, but they left her jewelry behind. This was a fairly regular sight in the cities, but a mugging and a murder, one without sexual motive, on hiking trails? That made the case highly unusual. And if it was all about robbery, why had they left the jewelry? Detectives wondered if Ida had enemies, but it soon became clear she wasn't the kind of woman to get into serious disputes. All the police had to go on was the fact that it had been a .44 caliber gun in what looked like an execution. There was one faint glimmer of a lead. A witness recalled seeing two men in the hills that day. One was blond and behaving strangely, his movements erratic and hard to ignore. The other wore a dark blue jacket, visibly sweating despite the cool air. But other than these cryptic and puzzling details, it was a complete mystery. The murder shook up the hiking community, but life quickly went on as usual. It was chalked up to an isolated incident, until the next one. Another murder of a woman hiking alone. One murder on the trails was strange enough, but two? This just didn't happen. The body of 23-year-old Barbara Schwartz was discovered close to where they'd found Ida 6 months earlier. She'd gone out walking with her dog on March 8, 1980, and had not returned. This time, police had a witness, one who had seen the whole thing. When the man launched his attack, a young female hiker was close by, watching through a thicket of trees, petrified and silent. She later told detectives she got a clear look at the perpetrator. He was about 25, white, slim, fit-looking, handsome, with dark hair and a hooked nose. She remembered he was wearing hiking boots, blending in perfectly with the others on the mountain trails. Nothing about him seemed out of place. That was until he walked up to Barbara, struck up a brief conversation, and then without warning plunged a knife into her dog barking frantically at her side. Nearby, police discovered a pair of blood-stained glasses, and they hoped they belonged to the killer. That same day, other hikers reported seeing a man wearing glasses, but this one didn't fit in. He was about 40, clearly older than the suspect described by the witness who had seen the attack. He stood out even more because he was wearing a rain jacket. It was odd given the day was clear and dry, and this didn't align with the other witness's statement. She had described a much younger, handsome man as the killer, so the investigation remained focused on him, a decision that would turn out to be a very costly mistake. A few days later, police had the murder weapon, a 10-inch knife with a bone handle. A TV reporter found it, and it didn't help matters that he had touched the handle. It was definitely the weapon that had killed Barbara. There was still blood on the blade. The design of the glasses was distinct, and that led back to a specific grocery chain. Detectives believed that this could be the breakthrough they needed, but despite combing through recent purchases, they came up empty. No young, white, bespectacled males had made any purchases matching the timeline. The glasses were also a major piece of evidence. They were prison issue, so it was possible they were looking for someone who had recently been released. Detectives went through a list of former inmates now back on the streets, looking for young men with histories of violence against women. It felt like the right path, one that should have narrowed their search, but inexplicably the killer's name wasn't on any of those lists. They were in fact looking for 49-year-old David Joseph Carpenter. He was not someone you easily forgot, with a severe stutter that often rendered him barely able to communicate. He stood out, and at the time of the murders, he hadn't been a free man for long. His violent past was as chilling as it was telling. In 1960, he had brutally attacked a woman with a hammer, a crime that earned him 9 years behind bars. That woman, Lois, survived the attack, and she would go on to give birth to a celebrity just 3 years later. In 1969, David, a sociopath with an IQ of 125, was able to persuade his parole officers that he was rehabilitated. But as sociopaths are prone to do, he lied. In 1970, his reign of terror escalated. That January, he abducted Cheryl Lynn Smith, stabbing her during the attack. Miraculously, she managed to escape before he could fully act on his twisted fantasies. But his violence didn't end there. Later that same day, he broke into the home of Wilma Joyce. After a savage sexual attack, he fled the scene, stealing her car and leaving behind chaos and fear. 2 days later, he held Sharon O'Donnell hostage with a shotgun. She escaped as he was changing his car's license plates. 5 days later, he kidnapped and committed serious sexual misconduct against a young woman named Barbara. She later recalled how he had been oddly gentle with her infant child, a gesture that hinted at the warped workings of his mind. It seemed his violence was fixated solely on women, driven by a diseased need to dominate and harm. But shortly after the attack on Barbara, he was arrested. He was finally paroled again in 1979, when again he convinced the board he was a changed man. At the time, he was likely wearing the prison-issue glasses he would lose during his stabbing murder. It would be a major failure by police that those glasses didn't lead to his capture. David had a talent for blending into the ordinary, hiding his true nature. Even when someone was watching him commit murder, he looked nothing like the description the witness had provided, and to the few people who actually knew him, he didn't come across the least bit dangerous. He was a socially awkward loner who often lived with his mom, so seemed totally harmless. This was his superpower, looking weak rather than dangerous. Now with 2 murders on the mountain, the hiking community took precautions. But as spring turned to summer and summer to fall, the lone joggers and the walkers forgot about what had happened to Barbara and Ada. Soon, the trails were as popular as ever. Women started hiking alone again. Then, on October 15th, the beautiful Mount Tamalpais had become the scene of another brutal murder. This time, the victim was 26-year-old former Peace Corps volunteer Annie Alderson. She was last seen sitting alone, watching the sunset in the empty 5,000-seat Cushing Memorial Amphitheater, a famed outdoor venue 2,000 feet above sea level. The witness, a male caretaker, later admitted to police that he had nearly approached her. He wanted to warn her about the dangers of being alone as night fell in such a quiet, isolated area, especially given the recent murders. She was seen by another witness who gave police a location that was right next to where they had found the body of Ida. The execution-style murder was almost identical to Ida's, except this time the weapon was a .38, not a .44. There had also been a clear sexual motive in what must have been a long and harrowing ordeal for Annie. The perpetrator had evidently attacked her and allowed her to put her clothes back on. He might have told her that he would spare her, only to fire a single bullet through the right side of her head. By the way her body was placed against a stone, it also looked as though he had made her get on her knees right before he'd pulled the trigger. This time, he'd also taken a souvenir, an earring. It was almost certainly the work of the same killer, who police still believed to be 25 years old and handsome, a man the media would soon start calling the Trailside Killer. On Sunday, November 28th, detectives suspected he struck again, not once, but twice. The 2 victims found next to each other. 25-year-old local Shauna May had been hiking near 22-year-old Diana O'Connell, a visitor from New York City. Though the 2 women were not acquaintances, they were both reported to be missing around the same time. It seems O'Connell had started her hike on Friday, intending to walk a long trail that spanned Mount Wittenberg in the Point Reyes National Seashore Park, about 40 miles from San Francisco. It seems at some point she had the bad luck of hiking near May and the Trailside Killer. As detectives were searching for these 2 women, they discovered the bodies of Richard Stowers, 19, and Cynthia Moreland, 18, 2 lovers who were planning to get married. They had set off hiking on October 11th and had never returned. A search party had failed to find them. And while this was cause for concern, it was possible they'd eloped to some other part of the U.S. Now their badly decomposed bodies were under the gaze of detectives who still hadn't found May and O'Connell. An autopsy and ballistics report showed that the young couple had very likely been killed by the same person who executed Annie Alderson. Police had warned about hiking in the area alone, and now it seemed like the killer was prepared to murder men if they were with the woman he so dearly wanted. Later that same day, just 2 miles away, detectives made a grim discovery. The bodies of Shauna May and Diana O'Connell were found hidden in the rugged terrain. May's death was particularly brutal. She had been tied up with picture frame wire and subjected to serious sexual misconduct. Her killer then shot her 3 times in the head, execution style, before shoving her body into a shallow trench. O'Connell was found close by. Her friends told the police that they had been hiking with her that day, walking together along the trail. At one point, one friend got ahead while the other lagged behind, leaving O'Connell alone in the middle. They didn't notice her vanish from the trail. O'Connell had been shot once in the head, possibly at the same time as May. That afternoon, another hiker said they'd heard 4 shots ring out in the distance. O'Connell had also been the victim of serious sexual misconduct. Like May, she was found naked, her underwear stuffed into her mouth. Both girls' clothes and small backpacks were discovered nearby. Investigators theorized that the killer may have been in the midst of attacking one of them when the other unknowingly crossed his path and had fallen into his web. This case had just turned into a massacre, a vile sexually motivated mass killing, and given the positions of the bodies, the work of a sadist who liked to watch people beg for their existence. That winter was one of the darkest in San Francisco's history. Hikers were reluctant to go out on the trails, especially alone. Police were dealing with a serial killer, a man with obviously twisted fantasies, which is why they enlisted the help of criminal profilers at the FBI's still fairly new Behavioral Science Unit, aka Quantico. This was where Special Agent John E. Douglas had conducted interviews with the likes of Edward Kemper, Ted Bundy, and John Wayne Gacy to better understand the minds of the men who commit serial murder. He and Special Agent Roy Hazelwood, a sex crimes expert, were tasked with composing a profile for the Trailside killer. He was obviously the organized kind of serial killer, one of the intelligent, meticulous planners, as opposed to a disorganized kind who tends to act on explosive, uncontrollable emotions. They said the murders had been planned, not opportunistic. This man wanted to watch his victims squirm, no doubt letting them believe he might be gracious and spare them. Murder for him wasn't impulsive, but a ritual he thought about every day of his life. They said it was highly likely he had held down a job, possibly blue-collar work. His familiarity with the local hiking trails suggested he lived and worked in the area, giving him an intimate knowledge of the terrain where he hunted his victims. Profilers believed he was likely proficient at his job and would come across as fairly normal. But beneath the surface, his personality was reclusive. His ultimate goal was to control his victims, which they said came from a pathological insecurity. Douglas explained, he has some kind of defect that really bothers him. One of the potential traits Douglas identified was a severe speech impediment, an insight that raised eyebrows among traditional detectives. Profiling was still a relatively new and often untrusted tool in investigations, and many viewed it as a hoodoo approach to solving murders. Douglas explained that the control the killer felt before killing his victims was how he compensated for his defect. Until then, psychologists had said the killer was probably a good-looking charmer, which was how he'd been able to sway young women from the trails. The profilers said the opposite. This wasn't the work of a sweet-talking sadist. They said he was probably quite unappealing and lacking in confidence. He likely wet the bed as a child and could have been cruel to animals, a consequence of violence, neglect, trauma, or all three. Using serial killer terminology, he was a lust killer, meaning he carefully selected his victims for a ritual of domination and sadism that fulfilled his sexual fantasies. Douglas miscalculated the killer's age, estimating he was in his 30s. But he was accurate when he said the murders were an escalation, building upon years of sexual misconduct and violent behavior toward women. They said no doubt he'd been in prison before, and while he might not have looked particularly dangerous, he was like a spider waiting for a bug to fly into his web. He'd chosen secluded areas because this wasn't the kind of man who'd be able to approach women in social environments. He lived with shame and debilitating shyness, hiding out on the fringes of society. This was powerful information, but detectives still focused on the 25-year-old that their best witness had seen, not for much longer. In the spring of 1981, the Trailside killer struck again. This time, hunting grounds shifted to Santa Cruz, once infamously known as the serial killer capital of America. The area had already been scarred by the terrifying legacies of Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer, and Herbert Mullen, a paranoid schizophrenic who believed his murders could prevent earthquakes. Ellen Marie Hansen and Stephen Hartle were both undergraduates at the University of California at Davis. They'd been walking in the Henry Cowell Redwood State Park on March 29th when they were approached by a man. Ellen was killed instantly. Stephen was shot twice and left for dead, but he survived and he was able to tell police what had happened, down to the smaller details. He and Ellen had been hiking that day when they heard a man grunting behind them. This guy caught up and made eye contact but walked right past, mumbling something to himself as he disappeared into the distance. They were later walking through the redwoods when they saw him. Stephen said the man stopped, and in a sinister voice he said, "We meet again." The man pulled out a gun from his jacket, after which he tried to reassure Stephen by saying, "I won't hurt you. He said he just wanted his girlfriend and then he would leave them be. The two started backing up, Stephen pleading with him not to hurt them, at which point Ellen turned to him and said, "Stephen, he's going to shoot us anyway, don't listen to him." She was right. Stephen heard 3 gunshots. All he could remember was Ellen falling and then 2 more shots before his world turned black. When he woke up, he was covered in blood, Ellen dead at his side. He scrambled to his feet and he soon found the help of other hikers, but by this time the killer had run off into the distance. After a hospital stay, Stephen told his story, despite the 2 bullets that had hit him in his neck. The theory of the 25-year-old handsome man with what cops had said was a winning personality was finally put to bed. Stephen said the man who had killed his girlfriend and almost killed him was more like 50. He wore glasses, looked kind of ugly, had crooked yellow teeth, and a balding head. He was wearing a blue windbreaker, was about 5'10", 170 pounds, and notably, he spoke really quickly, but he didn't mention a severe stutter. Now the trails were almost empty. All around Northern California's national parks, you could find bright orange signs that said, "Do not hike alone." One at the Point Reyes Trail warned women should be especially cautious. Sheriff's deputies often stopped cars close to the trailheads. License plates were taken. Everyone was on edge. The newspapers printed the photo fit image taken from Stephen's memory, adding that other witnesses had said the man had been seen in a red vehicle. Below the information was a hotline number. A few days later, someone called it. It was a woman in her 60s who said she would never forget that face. 26 years ago, she'd met him on a cruise ship where he was working as a purser. She remembered him because he was inappropriate toward her young daughter, creepily laying his hand on her shoulder. Her daughter had earlier chatted with him and asked him to sign her travel book. He did. His name, still scrawled in that book almost 3 decades later, was David Carpenter. But there were a lot of David Carpenters in the state of California. Police followed up but didn't find David Carpenter the killer. Meanwhile, he was at it again. After seeing his face in the newspapers, he tried to evade detection by growing a beard. It was this newly disguised man who on May 2nd crossed paths with 20-year-old Heather Scruggs. That day, Heather had told her boyfriend she was meeting a colleague, a man named David Carpenter. Carpenter, she explained, knew someone selling a car she was interested in. She reassured her boyfriend, brushing off any concerns, saying he was harmless. Heather was a student at Econo Quick Print where David taught her how typesetting machines worked. He'd been very friendly to her in the past. Sure, he was a little strange, but he gave her rides home after work, and he even offered to loan her the cash for the new car. It was almost as if he were pressuring her into buying it. Her boyfriend, Dan Pingle, thought that this was strange, as did her mom, who also told her not to go. At least Dan persuaded her to give him David's full name and address. For a man with a 125 IQ, David was certainly making a lot of very obvious mistakes. Maybe with the trails now so surveilled by police, he was desperate to find a new victim. In serial killer history, out-of-character recklessness in desperation is actually quite common. So David is not alone in how he got caught, just as Dan and her mom had feared. Heather didn't return that night. Dan soon showed up at David's house only to be informed that Heather hadn't met him. Suspicious, Dan went to the police. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him, especially after learning that David had specifically told Heather not to tell anyone where she was going. So again, police had the name David Carpenter. They soon found out he was an ex-con with a long line of convictions for violence against women as an adult and during his youth. It soon became depressingly evident how he had slipped through the cracks. His name should have been on that list of recently released prisoners when those prison-issue glasses had been found at the scene of a murder. He was almost identical to the photo fit. He was exactly the type of person described by the profilers at the FBI. All of the boxes were ticked. History of violence, defect, stutter, shy, smart, socially awkward, a loner who lived with his mother at the age of 51. It had to be him. Detectives set up a surveillance van outside of the house and watched David's every movement. One day he left the house with a shopping bag, and that's when they decided to approach him, not wanting to risk him killing anyone else. As soon as they told him they were detectives, he demanded a lawyer, and in a weak voice told them, "Please don't hurt me." Armed with a warrant, they found over 60 maps in his house for hiking trails all over Northern California. They found a bunch more in his car, a red Fiat, which had recently had a change of license plates. Several witnesses visited the police station, and most picked his face in lineups, as did Stephen Hartle, who said with confidence, "That's him." David was subsequently charged with murder and arraigned. barely able to speak full sentences to the judge without stuttering his words. At the press conference after, police said this was the man, the Trailside killer, emphasizing how he had psychologically tortured his victims before murdering them. But Heather Scruggs was still missing, and David was still denying that she had met him that day to buy the car. She'd last been seen outside a convenience store on May 2nd. It wasn't until May 24th when her decomposing body was discovered hidden in the brush in Big Basin Redwoods Park. It looked as though a leaf had been placed on her face, which had happened with the other victims too, and one of her earrings was missing. It was only later, with the help of dental records, that the body was confirmed as hers. This was another ritualistic, sexually motivated attack. The victim was forced onto her knees, her life taken with 2 bullets fired piggyback style, one directly on top of the other, like a professional execution. It looked as though his tally was 9, but there wasn't enough evidence to get him on all of them. He'd used the same .38, but not for Ida Kane. And then there was the stabbing of Schwartz, but they could definitely get him on the rest. The profile Douglas and Hazelwood had compiled was almost perfect. While it's impossible to feel sorry for him, he had been violently abused as a child by an alcoholic father and a very domineering mother, the worst kind of duo for parenting. He'd led an unusual existence, constantly beaten yet forced to do ballet and learned piano, the former being something he took a lifelong interest in. He'd renewed his ballet season ticket right after he murdered Heather. He was a messed up child who hurt animals, and after maturing he was arrested for molesting his female cousins, the precursor to a lifetime of serious violence. It seems his very first serious assault as an adult was the woman in 1960 with the hammer. She testified that he had taken her out to the woods, and after tying her up with a clothesline, he had told her he had a funny quirk he needed to satisfy. When she didn't comply, he viciously attacked her. She said the strangest thing was during her ordeal, when he was satiating his needs, he suddenly lost his stutter. It was as if hurting women was his cure, just as the profilers had said. This woman, by the way, was the mother of the American TV soap opera royalty Lisa Rinna, famed for her roles in The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills and Days of Our Lives. Her mother was very fortunate not to be murdered. The attack was spotted by a military patrol officer. He later said, "Even when he saw me coming down the hill, he kept hitting her." David pulled a gun and tried shooting, but so did the officer, hitting David in the thigh and the abdomen. As the profilers had said, while very shy, he seemed almost normal to other people. He was married at the time of the hammer attack. He had a university degree and a fairly good job. His wife, who later said he controlled her sexually, was pregnant with their 3rd child. With every woman after that, including strangers, the lust always reared its ugly head. And as these things tend to go, it eventually escalated to murder. After being found guilty of 5 murders in Marin County, he was later convicted of the Santa Cruz crimes, the murder of Ellen, of Heather, and the attempted murder of Stephen, and sentenced to die in the gas chambers at San Quentin Prison. In the cases of Barbara Schwartz and Ida Kane, while never convicted, he remains the main suspect. Then in 2009, DNA evidence led to another conviction, the murder of Mary Frances Bennett, a young woman who had been stabbed to death while jogging in Land's End Park, close to the Golden Gate Bridge in 1979. He remains on death row today, now the ripe old age of 94, where he continues to claim he is an innocent man. A wild-eyed and aging Charles Manson is asked in an interview who he actually is. He goofs around a little, playing the madman he's expected to be, and whispers, "Nobody." He goes on, "I'm nobody. I'm a tramp, a bum, a hobo. I'm a boxcar and a jug of wine, and a straight razor if you get too close to me." Who was he? It's a good question. He became the embodiment of the American monster, a totemic ghoul representing the downfall of a decade that changed a country. He was a brutal winter that followed a summer of love. If you believe the hype, Manson was the evilest man in the world, the personification of a society gone wrong. He might have been bad, but if he was as evil and powerful as many people made him out to be is another question. The story of Manson has changed a lot over the years, especially since a guy named Tom O'Neill published an account of the Manson murders that took him 20 years to research. That book is called Chaos: Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s, and our indefatigable researchers at the Infographics Show have read it. The Manson we all know from earlier books, especially Helter Skelter, the true story of the Manson murders, isn't quite the same guy after reading that. We won't go too much into Manson's upbringing, but we will say that the young Charles Manson didn't have the best start in life. He was bruised and broken from a young age. He was the fallout from the American dream, and crime became second nature to him, the petty stuff, at least during his younger years. He might have been the scapegoat that was set up to be the man that pretty much ended the idealism of the 60s counterculture. After his crimes came to light, the curtain was drawn on the hippie era, and it was business as usual in the USA. The final credits rolled over the glare of Manson's deranged face. What's interesting when we talk about how he got caught is how he also got away numerous times with a lot of crime. O'Neill's book tells us something we didn't fully understand about Manson's life. That is, he was arrested many times, but for some reason that doesn't make much sense. The cops just kept letting him go. O'Neill suggests that the cops released Manson on many occasions because someone wanted him released. Maybe Manson was part of someone's bigger plans. We know for a fact that the CIA back in those days was working on mind control projects using LSD. We also know that Manson, the Messiah, managed to get folks who followed him to commit some terrible crimes. The big question nowadays is, did the CIA use Manson as one of the test subjects, and did Manson employ the same mind control techniques on his family? By the time he was 32, he spent more than half his life in prison. Then in 1967, he violated his parole by leaving the state he was in and somehow got away with it. He ended up in San Francisco, where he became part of drug experiments at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. O'Neill cannot connect Manson with the CIA's own experiments, but let's just say the connection is plausible. In light of his story, we'll say that Manson was certainly a blip on the radar of the authorities. By the time he was arrested, that blip looked more like a coat of paint. It was around this time that he started his cult, the Manson family. It was also around this time that 10050 Cielo Drive, a house in Benedict Canyon, LA, was frequented by the rich and famous, the starlets, the freaks, anyone wanting a good time under the influence of a cornucopia of drugs. That's where up-and-coming actress Sharon Tate lived with her husband, film director Roman Polanski. This is where Polanski made videos of her. Let's just say some of those shoots were highly unethical. That remained a secret for a long time. What exactly went down in that house prior to the murders remains partly a mystery, but we know what happened on August 9, 1969. That was the murder of 5 people. Under the orders of Manson, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel went to the house. Polanski was away in Europe making a movie, but Tate, then 8.5 months pregnant, was at home. Also in the house were Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, and Stephen Parent. Watson later testified he, Manson, said for me to take the gun and knife and go up to where Terry Melcher used to live. He said to kill everybody in the house as gruesome as I could. I believe he said something about movie stars living there. Terry Melcher is another story. He was a music producer who'd come to know Manson through the Beach Boys star Dennis Wilson. Melcher had once expressed interest in Manson's music only to snub him later. Melcher later lied under oath about the full extent of his relationship with Manson. Let's just say that Manson didn't like him after that rebuff of his questionable talents. He's also thought he still lived at the house at the time of the murders, or at least that's one story. Manson might have known Melcher didn't live there anymore. What seems sure, if you believe O'Neill's compelling research, is that Melcher knew Manson a whole lot better than he made out in court. It seems Melcher had been in a relationship with one of the young female Manson family, and that Tex Watson knew the house very well. He'd been in there many times before the night of the murders, according to O'Neill. So, all these people, the hippie freaks and the stars who were somehow mixed up. Manson had stayed with Wilson for a while before he and his family moved to a place called Spawn Movie Ranch, an abandoned place no longer used to shoot movies. On the night of the murders, Watson climbed up a telephone pole and cut the phone line to the house. The women were waiting nearby. The first of the victims, 18-year-old Parent, was the first to die. He approached Watson and asked what he was doing at his house, which ended with Parent being shot 4 times. Parent was only really at the house by accident. He wasn't part of this so-called scene. Watson then got to the house through a window and let the girls in through the door. Frykowski, who was asleep on the couch, was rudely awakened. Surprised, he asked Watson what he was doing in the house. Watson replied, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." One of the girls, Atkins, then got a towel and tied Frykowski's hands with it. Atkins, under Watson's order, went to see who else was in the house. She found Abigail Folger, a 25-year-old woman heir to a coffee business fortune, and she was the girlfriend of Frykowski. When Atkins walked into the bedroom, Folger was reading a book. This being a house where many people came and went, Folger just looked up and smiled at Atkins. Atkins then walked down the hall and looked into another room. There she saw the pregnant Tate dressed only in her underwear, chatting with Sebring, a 35-year-old celebrity hairstylist. He'd once been the boyfriend of Tate, a young woman who just played her biggest film role in The 13 Chairs. Tate had been in good spirits, landing that role, about to have a child, and often being the center of attention of what she called the love house. She was also married to a man who often demeaned her. Atkins went back to the living room and told Watson what she'd seen. They both tied Frykowski again, this time with a nylon rope. Atkins then walked back to the bedrooms with a knife in her hand and ordered everyone to go to the living room. She said to Tate and Sebring, "Don't say a word or you're dead." Once in the living room, now frightened out of their lives, they pleaded with the intruders and offered them cash. All three of them were shoved onto their fronts and placed next to the fireplace. Watson tied a rope around the necks of Sebring and Tate and tied the same piece of rope to a beam in the ceiling. Sebring pleaded again, this time telling the intruders that Tate was obviously pregnant and this was disgusting behavior. Watson shot him on the spot. The others screamed. The rope tightened around Tate's neck. Watson then knelt down and repeatedly stabbed Sebring. He told one of the girls to turn off the lights. Tate screamed, "What are you going to do with us?" Watson replied, "You're all going to die." Frykowski managed to get out of his binds, but Atkins was soon on him, stabbing him numerous times all over his body. With blood everywhere, he tried to run out the door, but Atkins ran after him. Watson put 2 bullets into Frykowski and then broke the butt of the gun after hitting him over the head. Folger, still in her nightgown, managed to make a run for it. She got as far as the lawn when one of the girls, Krenwinkel, got up with her. Krenwinkel drove the knife into her 28 times. By the time Watson arrived to do more damage, Folger just said, "I give up. I'm already dead. Take me." Tate was now crying in the living room with Atkins standing next to her. Tate pleaded with him. It didn't work. She was also stabbed many times. Atkins used some of her blood to write "pig" on the wall. Manson had given orders earlier to leave a sign, something witchy. They all returned to the ranch and went to bed. Atkins later said, "I could not think about anything. It was almost as if I had passed out, blacked out. My head was blank. There was nothing in me." When the media found out about the murders, they called it an orgy of violence. The LA Times wrote ritualistic slayings. This caused widespread panic, especially in an era where more conservative folks believed these freaks with long hair were destroying the fabric of society. Some reports even said Sebring had been wearing a black hood, a Satanist's hood. Then there was Polanski, a man who made the horror movie about Satanists called Rosemary's Baby. Some said Polanski himself was an occultist. There were rumors that he'd been at a party in London and said, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, who will be the next to go?" Then the phone rang and he was told about the slayings. That never really happened. Even with all the hysteria, Manson wasn't content with the panic. The next night, he and 6 of the family went out hunting in an old Ford. They drove for 3 hours and then pulled up outside a house, 3301 Waverly Drive. They had no idea who lived there. Manson ordered Watson and Krenwinkel and a now new-to-be killer Leslie Lulu Van Houten to do the killing. Manson had just snooped around the house, and when he got back to the car, he told them what to do. Inside the house was the supermarket executive Leno LeBianca and his wife, Rosemary. Both were stabbed by Watson with a bayonet, and Leno was stabbed by the girls with a knife. The word "war" was carved into her belly. Watson took a shower, and the girls used blood to write "rise" and "death to pigs" on the walls. Krenwinkel also daubed the words "Hilter Skelter" on the fridge. She meant to write "Helter Skelter," the name of a Beatles song. She also planted a steak knife in the woman's neck. At that point, Manson and the others had already driven away, leaving the killers to make their own way home. As for Helter Skelter in Britain, it's a swirling slide for kids. According to Vincent Bugliosi, the prosecutor and writer of the best-known Manson book Helter Skelter, the cult believed in a race war related to that name. They killed because they wanted the murders to be blamed on blacks, which would result in a race war, and they would hide out in the desert as it happened. When the war was over, they'd return and take power from the winners of the war, the blacks. This theory is as far out as the hippies he was talking about. Tom O'Neill doesn't believe a word of it. In fact, he said Bugliosi made a lot of it up and lied about a lot more. For that, Bugliosi threatened to sue O'Neill if he ever published the book. Manson himself denied there was ever a Helter Skelter-focused plan. He once explained why the term was used, saying, "It means confusion, literally. It doesn't mean any war with anyone. It doesn't mean that some people are going to kill other people. Helter Skelter is confusion." He also said, as far as lining up someone for some kind of Helter Skelter trip, that's the district attorney's motive. That's the only thing he could find a motive for to throw on top of all the confusion he had. There was no such thing in my mind as Helter Skelter. Let's remember here that Manson didn't actually kill anyone, so there had to be a conspiracy. The press went along with it. Manson might not have been a serial killer, he was portrayed as something even worse. It was said the Manson family were bloodthirsty robots controlled by an evil Pied Piper who followed Manson with blind obedience. They belonged to a hippie drug and murder cult. They were the result of children taking drugs, growing their hair long, and complaining about war and corruption, and talking too much about freedom. They were what happens when you don't do what you're told. That's why many people think the CIA might have had a hand in creating this kind of chaos. Okay, so back to the main story. At first, the LAPD said there was no connection between the Tate and LaBianca homicides, although they couldn't ignore the similarities and some connection with what they called the singing group the Beatles. According to Bugliosi's account, the Manson family had left the Spahn Ranch to go searching for the place in the desert where they would lay low while whites and blacks fought each other in the race war. It's true that Manson and some of his followers had relocated to Death Valley. That's where they were later picked up by the cops, not for murder but for car theft. The officers involved had no idea who they had on their hands. Meanwhile, cops in LA spoke to bikers who talked about how the family was linked to the murders. Also, a friend of Atkins had told cops that she'd been involved in the murders. She also was wanted in connection with another murder. The victim was Gary Hinman, and he'd been killed prior to the other killings. The reason was apparently Manson believed he owed money to the family. In this case, Manson had done some of the dirty work, slashing Hinman and cutting some of his ear off. Still, Hinman was killed by another member of the family. The word political piggy was written on the wall, although this wasn't a politically motivated crime. Years later, it was said the killing was simply over drugs or drug money. The political thing could have been a ruse because the family wanted the blame to fall on the Black Panthers, an African-American political organization. Atkins admitted to police she'd been involved in that murder. While in a detention center, she then told the inmates that the family was behind the other murders. Now cops went after the family. They got warrants and arrested Watson and some of the other women. Remember, Manson and the others were already in detention for the car theft thing. Now they had most of them rounded up. They used fingerprint evidence to connect some dots, and police also found the gun used to shoot Parent, but they didn't find the knives. They did, however, find bloodied clothes ditched after the Tate murders. The trial was a media fest if there ever was one. The girls acted the part, laughing and smiling and generally looking like crazed hippies. No doubt they were crazed hippies, but they might not have been as demonic as was made out. They were young and stupid, if anything, and also heartless, brutal killers. A member named Linda Kasabian, who hadn't killed anyone, had been a lookout on one of the nights. She might have also stopped another set of murders from happening. It helped the prosecution greatly that she testified against the others. Charles Manson was eventually convicted on 7 counts of first-degree murder for the Tate LaBianca crimes. Manson, as well as Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, were handed the death penalty, but those were commuted to life sentences after the abolishment of the death penalty in California. People said that was the end of the 60s era. Idealism was dead. It is Manson only, really, who has gone down in history. The girls might also have been his victims, was the rationale given by some people. Manson was the male puppet master, even if Watson had done much of the slaying. Atkins died in prison in 2009. Krenwinkel, now 73, is still in prison. 72-year-old Van Houten is also still in prison right now, as is 75-year-old Tex Watson. Manson died in prison in 2017. He didn't rant a lot during the years of his incarceration, coming off for some people as the nobody he once admitted to being. To others, he was the fiend of all fiends. Why did they really do what they did? It's doubtful the race war was anything to do with it. Manson might have been the leader, but if he had some big grand plan that only a demigod could implement, it's perhaps a bit overblown. He was an angry man with an influence over impressionable lost folks. Like many maniacs, he also tried to justify the unjustifiable. He once said, "These children that come at you with knives, they are your children. You taught them. I didn't teach them. I just tried to help them stand up. Most of the people at the ranch that you call the family were just people that you did not want." As for if the CIA had anything to do with the Manson family, well, that will always remain top secret, but so-called spooks could well have lived in the shadows.